Brandon Morgan here, Director of Education at Kabuki Strength, and today we're going to be talking about optimizing movement quality intervention for coaches, trainers, clinicians, or whoever the hell you are that happens to be working with somebody or working with yourself towards optimizing your movement quality, just like anybody should if they're actually training. Because the consistent issue that so many people out there have is they don't know what the hell to start with. They see their movement quality or somebody else's movement quality, and it has 10 different issues, and what they start with is actually rather important, yet there's no framework to decide what the top of the hierarchy issue is. So let's go ahead and get a little bit more into what those things are, because here's the deal. If you start with the right thing, when there's a slew of issues within movement quality, if we start with the top of the hierarchy item, oftentimes 8 out of the 10 issues tend to go away. It creates a very robust effect to the lifter's movement quality and does the best job at preventing injury and optimizing their ability to handle load. This guided solution will start with a lecture portion. I'll try to make this relatively short and sweet. I want this to be more so focused on the practical application side of things, but there's some information we have to preface with to really understand the principles at play here. The first of which is going to be the hierarchy of movement pattern intervention that we here at Kabuki have developed and really push. Now, basically, there's 4 different components, 3 in particular we're going to talk about today, in which we will go through when we see a lifter have issues with all of them, which is actually quite common. So we'll start with the hierarchy in the lecture section, then we'll move on to breathing and bracing basics. And keep in mind, when I say basics, a lot of the basics behind breathing and bracing are actually things that very few people have a remote understanding of, as I have came to the conclusion of being able to travel around the world and putting on seminars, even trainers that have been at it for a very long time, even professional strength coaches for MLB, NFL, these really big teams have very little understanding of the deeper nuances behind breathing and bracing. Now, we're not going to go too deep in the weeds when it comes to it, but we will likely spend the most amount of time talking about breathing and bracing in the lecture just because there's so much to cover, so much vital information to cover. Now, are we going to get into individual stabilizers? Are we going to get into the deepest, most granular nuance? Not so much. I'm going to make a conscious point to not do that. I just want to talk about the prefacing information to understand the practical application side of why we do what. Then lastly, in the lecture section, we're going to talk about rooting and foot ankle complex. Now, typically, in our Principles of Loaded Movement seminar and similar seminars, there's a few other concepts that we talk about at length. I'm trying to make this as minimalistic as possible because realistically, when you look at somebody's movement quality or you look at the totality of faults people tend to run into, movement faults that is, if the lifter can optimize their breathing and bracing and rooting foot ankle complex, 95% of issues dissipate. It is amazing how robust of an effect that can have on a lifter. And it's also amazing how many movement faults simply are stemming from breathing and bracing limitations. Now, once we are done with the lecture section, we're going to get into the practical application side of things, where the first thing we'll touch on is the most common faults. Now, when it comes to common faults, this, amongst many other things, can be an entire lecture in itself. It is an exhaustive list we could produce as far as common movement faults. But for today, we're going to stick to the most common. We're going to stick to the ones that we see 90% of the time when lifters run into resistance in their actual resistance training. And we'll talk about how we would go about addressing them. Now, we're going to divvy up those movement faults into 4 distinct categories. The first of which is going to be positional faults. Second of which, breathing and bracing faults. The third is going to be hinging faults. And then lastly, rooting and foot ankle complex faults, which again, those 4 faults are the biggest contributors towards major movement concerns that we have to fix if we want to optimize things for the lifters or yourself. Now, next we're going to get into in-movement fixes. At Kabuki, we have a very simple philosophy, one that many people do not understand, and that is, if you can fix the problem in the movement itself, you always should. It seems like the industry has more of a bias towards a saying that's similar to this: when in doubt, regress it out. That's what it seems like they are following in their head, and we could not disagree more. A lot of coaches, trainers, clinicians, especially clinicians, when in doubt, they just regress. They regress until the regressions are so non-specific to the lift itself, the carryover is practically non-existent. Meanwhile, with some simple cues, some simple drills, they could have gotten rid of the issue in the movement itself in a way to where it would have saved them time, saved them resources, and had a much better effect on the lifter's movement quality quality and success towards working towards our goals. So we'll talk about in-movement fixes. And then next, we'll talk about if we need to regress. Here's how we do so. Here are the regressions we bias towards to create the best carryover to fixes in the movement. Then lastly, we'll briefly get into the warm-ups we suggest, warm-up drills specifically we suggest to potentiate movement quality, specifically looking at the specific faults the lifter is having, and then talking about how we would actually mix in very particular drills to help with said faults into the warm-up to potentiate performance and get rid of the fault itself prior to even doing the major movement that day. It is amazing how much effect can be produced by simply designing a very thought out movement plan with a lot of the drills that we're going to cover here today. So that's a general overview where we're going to talk about. Let's go ahead and get into it, starting off with some personal stories from myself on why efficient movement pattern intervention is incredibly important. As a strength coach, as a clinician, as a personal trainer, or whoever the hell you are, there is a very unfortunate truth we have to admit to. We have to come to terms with, and that is the number one goal of someone like myself. The number one goal of a strength coach is to create more robustness, to create more resiliency for the athlete themselves within strength training to make sure they do not get injured on the field if they're say an athlete, or if you're a personal trainer in a commercial gym environment training an elder population individual, then it's going to be less of an issue on the field, more of an issue of a slip and fall or something like that. But the number one goal we have is to develop a program that allows the person to gain more resiliency. The thing is though, poorly executed training can just as easily, I would go as far as to argue, can more easily create fragility as it can resiliency. You can just as easily, if not more easily, increase injury likelihood as you can decrease injury likelihood. And the number one factor that dictates which one of these roads you're going to go down is your ability to improve movement quality efficiently as a coach. If you cannot affect positive changes in a lifter's movement quality, you are dead upon arrival as far as creating the best results for them. But I'll take it a step further. You may actually do more harm than good. And that's the unfortunate truth of a strength coach, of a trainer, of a clinician. And unfortunately, I've seen that firsthand time and time again. Your ability to improve movement quality in a timely fashion, in a fashion that gets the best effect possible, is incredibly important. And it is the major factor that decides whether you are going to create fragility or resiliency, while your number one goal is typically to create resiliency. Now, talking about specifically the hierarchy of movement pattern intervention, prior to getting into that, I want to give a quick story about how these principles affected me initially. So when I first went to a Kabuki Strength Principles of Loaded Movement seminar, I was a personal trainer that also worked as a collegiate strength coach, but most of my hours were spent at a commercial gym training Gen Pop. With this being said, I had one specific lifter that I saw from afar that was actually going for his first powerlifting meet. He was in his upper 40s, something to that effect. And I saw another personal trainer on staff working with him, and it was a shit show. I was grinding my teeth watching it. It was so hard to watch, because watching this lifter from afar, they were working on the squat. He was a pretty strong individual naturally, immediately was pushing numbers that were pretty impressive. But if you look at his squat pattern, immediately dumped into massive anterior pelvic tilt. Prior to the anterior pelvic tilt, he had such a vertical breathing pattern that he was actually going into lumbar extension as he took his breath. He had concentric activity of the trunk stabilizers, which we really don't want. We'll get into that a little bit more here later on. As he squatted down, there was massive knee caves, just aggressive collapsing inwards or pronation of the foot. It was just problem after problem after problem. And what the conclusion the personal trainer came to is they saw this and go, well, it looks like you have tight hamstrings and IT bands, so let's have you do some tissue work. And I proceeded to see for the next 4 to 6 weeks, this poor guy just do 30 to 45 minutes straight of tissue work prior to every session. And then guess what happened? Every time he went to squat, the same exact issues kept happening. The personal trainer's solution was that he needed to regress aggressively and just do a shit ton of tissue work because muscles were tight, and that's what was pulling him into anterior pelvic tilt, so on and so forth. At least I think that's where he was going. That's generally where they come from. With this being said, one day I was actually happening to prepare for a powerlifting meet. One day I was in a commercial gym, squatting as much as 600 pounds. It was a shit show. The bar was bending, not the greatest setting to do that in, but this particular person, upon seeing me do that, walked up to me and asked me for advice. And I was chomping at the bit to give him advice. I thought, finally, it's my time. Let's do this. So immediately I told him I'd love to help him. Let's see the squat. He got in front of me, unracked the barbell, walked it out. Right before he went to, and then he did a squat for me. All these faults existed. And I said, okay, hold a second. What I want you to do is close your eyes. Gave him a tactile cue. I want you to breathe into my finger. No, don't go too quick. 5-second inhale, nice and slow, breathe into my fingers. He proceeded to breathe horizontally, beautifully. He followed up by a strong co-contraction of his trunk stabilizers, eccentric activation, beautiful intra-abdominal pressure creation simply by providing some tactile cueing and some actual cueing. And then I proceeded to have him hinge and squat with a very slow tempo, gave him a few cues for the hinge mechanics. And as he did so, I'm not kidding when I say 90% of the faults that existed went away like that. It took all of 5 minutes, and we did it in the movement itself. Because here's the deal. What caused the cascade of faults wasn't tight musculature, and he definitely did not need to regress. Instead, it all started off with terrible positions that were created by awful breathing mechanics. He breathed so vertically in a compensatory manner that he went into massive anterior pelvic tilt, locked that down, and from then on out, his intra-abdominal pressure was a shit show. Trunk stabilization, obviously very awful as well, deviating at lumbar spine position. Because of that, he had decreased control of downstream structures, which made it increased likelihood of having rooting issues, and issues of stability at the hip caused an increased likelihood of knee cave. Now he's not having balance co-contractions of certain primary movers, so on and so forth. It was a cascade that all started with breathing and bracing, and by simply fixing it in the movement itself with some intelligent cueing, we got rid of virtually all of it. And when he got done, he was amazed. He was absolutely amazed. And it was wonderful for me to be able to apply these principles as I learned them just 4 weeks ago or so at a Principles of Loaded Movement seminar. It absolutely changed the way I saw movement. And after that, he ended up referring me out to every friend he had. And because I got rid of his back and knee pain, people came to me when they had back and knee pain. And I had to explain to person after person, no, not a chiro, not a PT. That's outside of my scope. You have pain, go see someone else. You want to move better, come see me. And I'm getting a lot of clients from it. So with this being said, it's just kind of a quick story, not so much a bragging session. I promise you that's not the intent, but it's a story that kind of describes how powerful these principles are, but furthermore, how important it is to optimize movement quality efficiently. Because when it's all said and done, this wasn't an intention of mine, but this guy kind of hated his personal trainer. He dropped him like a sack of potatoes, just like that. He wanted nothing to do with him because realistically, he wasted 5-6 weeks of his life doing 45-minute tissue work sessions before every single training session because the personal trainer had a root cause in his head that was fundamentally incorrect. So that caused caused the athlete rather, to waste a shit ton of his time to consistently have movement faults that drove pain, did structural damage. And when he went with somebody that understood things a little bit better, to say the least. Again, less than 5 minutes is all it took. And then through more work with him, he got exponentially better, handled more loads, did so with less pain or no pain. So this is very important, very, very important stuff. And you'll notice in this story, what did I start with? Breathing, bracing, trunk stability. And that is the top of the hierarchy within our hierarchy for movement development, or our hierarchy for movement pattern intervention, however you want to verbalize it. Top of the hierarchy is breathing, bracing, and spine mechanics, and for very good reason. Your ability to stabilize here is the most important facet of all loaded movement, especially axial loaded movement. Every single movement that I do needs the prerequisite of some trunk stability here. Now later on, we'll get into the task-dependent nature of this, but if I bend down to grab my water bottle here, take a drink, trunk stability was required to do so. Even if I move my head position, trunk stability is needed to do so. All movement of limbs and pretty much all movement requires the prerequisite of some trunk stabilization. But when you get to heavier load, your ability to have maximal control of downstream structures, to maintain position, to keep the spine safe, the pelvis stable, safe to maintain optimal length-tension relationships with primary movers, so on and so forth. Always starts with this, but to take it a step further, the number one fault people have is issues or compensatory strategies to utilize this, which is why we start with breathing and bracing spine mechanics, or more specifically intra-abdominal pressure, which we'll get into here more in just a little bit. Now, the close second is going to be rooting and foot ankle complex, okay? This and your foot's connection with the floor are the two most important facets of movement quality by far. Any lifter out there, any person out there, if you can optimize those two things, it is unbelievable how far you will be propelled in the right direction towards moving without pain and moving heavier load more safely. So that is the primary components that we're talking about today. If we get further down this hierarchy, we start to get into shoulder girdle as well as hip, right? Shoulder girdle plays a lot of importance as well. I'll briefly touch on that in the application side of things, as for example, lat engagement scapular depression is vitally important to maximize trunk stabilization because lats are a spine stabilizer. So with that being said, that is our hierarchy, but it all starts with breathing, bracing, trunk stability, and then a close second being rooting. Let's get into more deeply what these mean or the basics behind it. But before even doing that, I want to talk about how we arrived at trunk stability's importance, okay? So it was very long ago, 10, 15-ish years ago, when Chris Duffin was just a guy going for some state records, probably wasn't the strongest in the world to say the least at the time. And he was chasing some big numbers though. And at that time, he went to see somebody by the name of Dr. Philip Snell, who happens to have an office right behind me in the same building as ours. We produce educational content with him, amongst many other things. But when Snell went to go see him, when Duffin went to go see Snell, he had a very specific idea of what was wrong with him. He was having some issues that he thought required certain methods of tissue work. And upon Snell really assessing him more deeply, what Snell noticed was, to put it simply, his breathing and bracing was kind of a shit show. Now, he could speak more to the nuance of it, the more particulars of the story. It's actually a really interesting story. But to sum it up really simply, Duffin looked at him and goes, what does a skinny clinician like you know about lifting? Heavy shit. And Snell convinced him to just give him a chance. And upon Snell teaching Duffin the principles of intra-abdominal pressure creation, all of a sudden Duffin's squat went up by 50 pounds overnight. Now, 99.9% of the time when someone says that, they are full of shit. So I wouldn't blame you for thinking that's the case in this situation here, but I promise it's not for this situation here. And upon Duffin learning that, he was amazed. He went and taught his training partner, Rudy, the same thing, same exact result, 50-pound increase like that or around it. And then they continued to teach every single person they trained with some of these principles. And then from there, they were bought in. They learned all the DNS principles that much of our education actually stems from. They start to utilize those principles to create more specific methodology and drills around strength sports specifically, and that kind of gave birth to our education here at Kabuki once Kabuki became a thing soon after that. And that's why Kabuki was kind of known as the education source that brought breathing, bracing, and trunk stability importance and knowledge base to all of strength sports. We were in a privileged position to be able to do that, and now it's very common knowledge within strength sports as a whole, but believe it or not, at the time, it was not. Everybody thought breathing and bracing was just basically the Valsalva maneuver, and most people didn't even know about that, to be honest. It was a shit show across the board. So upon them learning this, when no one else in the industry actually thought about it or knew about it, we were in a position to actually spread the good word and teach many people how to do this vitally important concept. So that's how trunk stability importance actually came to the forefront of our head, and that actually started, or one of the primary conduit to starting Kabuki strength education, which is why I'm where I'm at right now. Now let's get into diaphragm function and intra-abdominal pressure creation, as well as bracing as a whole. The first thing I want everybody to understand here is that breathing is not bracing. These are separate things that have an added effect to one another, right? With this being said, they are not the same. A lot of people think that breathing is synonymous with bracing and that it is bracing, and that is certainly not the case, and that drives people to take these big vertical compensatory breathing patterns prior to going through a squat. It ends up being a very poor strategy overall. With this being said, there's a certain anatomy pieces that we have to understand to truly understand intra-abdominal pressure creation. And to put it very simply, we can divvy those down, or we can minimize those down into three things: diaphragm, abdominal wall, and pelvic floor. Now, there's a ton more nuance we could get into there. For example, abdominal wall is made up of many different individual muscle groups, transverse abdominis being one of the most important ones that we could get into, the posterior stabilizers, individual obliques, so on and so forth. But we can make it really simple and just say abdominal wall for the time being. Now, with this being said, the initiating action, the major conduit to intra-abdominal pressure creation. And by the way, if you don't know what IAP is, intra-abdominal pressure, it simply is the pressure that we can create, the pressurization within our abdominal cavity that allows us to handle such great load, or is the main conduit to being able to handle such great load. Understand that there's an inverse relationship between pressure and volume. And when we go to actually take our breath, volume is decreased within our abdominal cavity and pressure is increased. That pressurization allows us to have the utmost spine trunk stability and many other things that I've already mentioned. Now, with this being said, the initiating action within creating intra-abdominal pressure is typically that breath, right? If you see really successful lifters go to squat, for example, they take that big breath in, followed up by a strong brace, a strong co-contraction of the trunk musculature. But what actually happens mechanistically? What happens mechanistically is our diaphragm is the initiating action. Our diaphragm plays a very strong role within this process. In fact, the initiating role. So with this being said, when we take our breath in and start to create intra-abdominal pressure creation, our diaphragm actually approximates or depresses downwards towards our pelvic floor. They work in opposition to one another, and as it does so, this compresses the fluids, the gases, the tissues within our abdominal cavity, and it presses them outwards in all directions. This is why when you see highly successful squatters that are also very efficient, such as the Joe Sullivans, such as the Chris Duffins, when you go to see them squat, what you'll notice is as they take their breath in, if you have a good enough angle, you'll clearly see that they don't just inflate or expand in the front, they also expand here, 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 all the way around in a 360 sheath. And that is the process in which I'm talking about. When the diaphragm descends down, approximates down towards the pelvic floor, it presses this abdominal content in all directions. We see eccentric activation or expansion in all directions. We often refer to that as omnidirectional breathing patterns. It happens everywhere, not just the front. The front is a very common fallacy within the industry or just people in general. So with this being said, that's the initiating action. Then we see the eccentric activation of our musculature in a 360 sheath all the way around our trunk, including back here, followed up by a strong muscular co-contraction that really seals the deal as far as creating this canister of pressure, this pressure cooker of pressure. There's many different ways we can visualize it or talk about it. One of our favorite actually is the guy wire analogy, which we'll get into here in just a second. But intra-abdominal pressure, how much of the equation within intra-abdominal pressure creation is breathing? How much is it exactly? Many people don't understand this. As I said earlier, breathing and bracing are separate, but they have an additive effect to one another. Breathing itself is about 15 to 20. We'll just stick with a specific number and say 15. Breathing itself is 15% of the trunk stability equation, right? So with this being said, the other 85% is the bracing. It's the muscular co-contraction, the muscular contraction itself. So when somebody goes to breathe and brace, that's the equation that we're talking about here. But a lot of people will overemphasize the breath portion. They get overzealous within breathing, and they end up actually hurting the other 85%. I'll get into that here more in a little bit, but by really over-exaggerating the breath and trying to chase breathing so much, people often end up, but in doing so, they passively lengthen the abdominal musculature and they decrease, the lifter decreases the muscular capability of creating that co-contraction, of creating the brace. So now in chasing perfection or overzealously trying to improve the 15% breath, they ruin the 85%. They trade 15% for 85%, realistically end up ruining both of them because even the vertical breathing pattern doesn't allow full approximation with the diaphragm towards the pelvic floor. So with all that being said, understanding the priorities based upon the percentages in which each contributes towards trunk stability actually really helps a lifter quite a bit. Now, as I mentioned previously, air is not the stabilizing force. Instead, air is a conduit to stabilization, not the only factor, definitely not the main factor, which is why when you see coaches yell at lifters, big air, there's a common saying, there is no bad cues, but I actually don't really like this saying. Really don't like it. The vast majority of the time, there actually is bad cues, but the sentiment that's getting at is that cues are highly individual to the person themselves, and most cues are appropriate in some way to some individual. But with that being said, I would bias towards other cues besides big air. I don't love big air because when people really focus on it, they get towards that overzealous breath that has the consequences I just talked about. Instead, I like to have the lifter focus on creating a ball of air in their stomach or breathing laterally into their belt. Another good cue is thinking about filling up a pitcher of water from the bottom up. All these cues are exponentially better when you look at the broad spectrum of lifters compared to big air. Big air often gets people in the wrong mindset as far as what they should be prioritizing. Now, next I want to talk about what happens when we do this ideally. As I mentioned previously, the guy wire system is a fantastic reference. The caveat that I've learned lately, though, is that not everybody knows what a guy wire system is. So we actually have one out in front of Kabuki. We have this big ass radio tower, and stemming from it in all directions connected to the floor is big ass wires. Why are these wires here? They're called the guy wire system. Why are they there? To aid in stability, to make the center structure resistant to change or the outside conditions, so that if a storm happens, if anything happens, the center structure will remain intact because it has the utmost stability based upon the guy wire system. When you do this optimally, we create an internal guy wire system. Now, the guy wire reference, I'm going to give credit where credit's due. One of our advisory board members, Stu McGill, which you should be aware of who he is, he actually created this analogy. It's a damn good one, really, really good one. But all that to say, when we create pressurization in all directions, we create an internal guy wire system. And when you look at a guy wire system to support a structure, you'll notice the wires aren't just in the front, they aren't just on the side, they are in every single direction to fully stabilize a center structure. And the same thing needs to happen here. If we pressurize optimally in all directions, we have the utmost stability for the center structure, which is our spine, our pelvis, and surrounding structures, which makes us allows us to handle the utmost load and axial loading setting, especially. Now, in a little bit, we're going to talk about very specific imbalances within people's ability to create that 360 stability, the most common of which is a lack in ability to utilize the posterior portion of the trunk. This is very, very common. And I'm going to talk about later some testing methods to assess this. I personally believe that every single lifter out there should have their stability, their inflation checked within the every portion of their trunk, because it's so often the lifter will have hip shift, a lifter will have severe knee cave on one side, they'll have a series of detrimental faults that they don't know why it's happening, but then upon assessment of their breathing and bracing, specifically the rigidity they're creating within the posterior portion of the trunk way back here, people end up finding out that they have a major asymmetry within their ability to create rigidity in the posterior portion of the trunk. For example, with me, I'm a really good example of this. I found this out recently. I had hip shift come out of nowhere, happened for quite some time. And when I actually got palpated, when I got tested, what I found was the right side back here was not inflating, and furthermore, was creating very little rigidity. When I went to take my breath in, left side inflated beautifully, expanded even more when I went to create rigidity. Right side was practically no inflation, and then a little bit out when I went to create rigidity, but that created a bilateral imbalance within my ability to stabilize a trunk, which had downstream consequences for one side specifically, which then created a slew of compensatory mechanisms to move the load that I did not want to have. And if I would have let that go on, there would have been a number of downward spiral kind of consequences, but luckily I addressed it and tried to nip it in the bud. Still working on it right now, but point is, it's actually very common where a lifter will lack the motor control to stabilize back here, to inflate back here. Another good example is the lateral portion, and when this happens, it should be assessed and it should be addressed, because if it's not looked at over time, there's major consequences that can happen, especially come in the form of major injuries. Now, last thing I want to talk about when it comes to IAP creation, trunk stabilization as a whole, understand that there's a task-dependent nature when it comes to trunk stability requirements. One of the best examples I like to bring up is CrossFit example of wall balls. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's a medicine ball that people take, they squat down, they press up, and goes way up high, hits the wall, bounces back towards them, and they have to catch it and immediately do it again. Pretty high intensity exercise when people do it. But with this being said, does it have the same trunk stability requirements as a barbell back squat? Hell to the no, which is why, guess what we don't need to hold our breath? We don't need that last 15% of the air holding part of trunk stability, due to the fact that trunk stability demands are so minimal when we're doing that with a 10-pound medicine ball. So instead, a simple muscular co-contraction where I can still breathe and maintain it That's all I need. That's all I need for the task at hand. Another good example, I bend over to pick up my water bottle. Very little trunk stability is needed to do that task. Some is, but very little. But when I go to do a 1 rep max back squat, I need every single semblance of trunk stabilization my body can create to do that well. So with this being said, I need that last 15%. In fact, I need 100%. So my position has to be perfect. My strategies have to be perfect. Inflation and 360 rigidity has to be perfect to really be able to handle that load to the top of my ability to do so. But then we make one more comparison. What about a 1 rep max squat compared to an easier set of 10 reps squat? Is requirements the same? Definitely not even close. In fact, with this being said, a lot of lifters, when they go to do 10 plus reps at a low intensity, they don't hold their breath every single rep. Now there's some mixed strategies in terms of how you can address this. For example, some people will still create full trunk stability, hold their breath, and then perform 2, 3, 4 reps at a time, reset at the top and do it again. But a lot of people will just simply create that 85% co-contraction of trunk musculature, not hold their breath, continually breathe throughout all those repetitions, because guess what? That's all they need for the task at hand. Think about the task-dependent nature of trunk stabilization like a dial. That dial can turn up to 10, that dial can turn down to 1. A good 1 example is picking up this water bottle. A good 3 example would be the wall balls of the medicine ball. A good, 6.5 example would be a 10 rep easy set of barbell back squat. And a good 10 example would be that 1 rep max squat. And we have to adjust our strategies depending upon the task at hand. A lot of lifters make the mistake of learning really good bracing and then doing that same bracing cadence and doing the same intention for all activities. Newsflash, I do not have to lift this up. That'd be ridiculous. Obviously, there's a task-dependent nature to all activities, though for all activities, trunk stabilization is needed. And the last thing I want to talk about in the breathing and bracing section is going to be the positional demands that are required to stabilize fully. Understand that we have a rib cage over pelvis position that's required to be able to have full depression, full approximation, full mobility, I guess you could say, of your diaphragm. To create intra-abdominal pressure fully, to create trunk stability fully, to create your brace fully, however you want to put it, we need to have this position right here. If we do not have this position, such as a really common example of anterior pelvic tilt, all of a sudden, your ability to create IEP is degraded significantly. You're dead upon arrival when it comes to trunk stability, when it comes to your brace, simply because of a positional deviation, which is very, very, very common. A lot of lifters will have terrible breathing and bracing, and they work on it so much, but they never go anywhere because they don't realize during the unrack of their squat every single time, they unrack like this, they walk out like this, they breathe and brace from there, and they don't know why they're breathing and bracing. Just feels terrible no matter what they do. It's because you have a positional limitation from the start that makes you dead upon arrival when it comes to trunk stability. So understand, the last thing I want to cover here when it comes to trunk stability, understand that position matters, and it matters a lot. We need a stacked rib cage over pelvis position with a neutral head position, might I add, which we'll get into here more in a little bit. We need this position to be able to fully generate trunk stability. If we do not have that, we are dead upon arrival. Within doing so, you'll still be able to create some, but not nearly as much as you otherwise could. Now next, let's go ahead and move on to rooting and foot ankle complex. I'll try to get through this relatively quickly. There's less nuance I want to cover, but first understand that when it comes to rooting 101, force production and upstream joint stability is dependent upon your foot's connection with the floor. Okay. In fact, more specifically, energy transfer, injury prevention, and 3 points of contact are kind of the main 3 categories that we like to talk about in reference to rooting. Whenever you see a lifter have massive degrees of knee cave or other issues of that nature, this is obviously going to be a major concern for energy transfer. And oftentimes the reason why that happens is because of a fundamental inability to root effectively. So many upstream faults start with rooting itself, and your foot's connection with the floor is the close second, might add, is the second most important foundation of loaded movement. But also understand that many lifters out there are dead upon arrival when it comes to their ability to connect well with the floor simply because of the shoe wear they use. Here's the thing about shoe wear. I don't want to sound like a hippie. I don't want to sound like somebody that's trying to sell a specific shoe product, which is why I'll say right now, the best shoe wear to use when you're learning how to root better is nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not even socks. Go barefoot, right? Not trying to sell a product here. But your shoe wear matters a lot. There's a few categories your shoe wear has to match or fall within to be considered optimal for squatting, deadlifting, and things of this nature. Understand that. Your brain has this amazing anti-injury mechanism where when it senses an instability downstream, it refuses to recruit as many muscle fibers or produce as much force. Most shoes out there are a instability that it senses. The best example, but also the worst example, are those pillow-soled, really fat, comfortable, but really fat-soled shoes that feel like a pillow with every step. They feel amazing, but when you see somebody try to squat in them, it's this the entire time. And then they report back to their coach or say online, I don't know why my squat feels so unstable. It's because of your shoes. Shoes matter a lot. So let's get into the specific requirements of a shoe. When it comes to a shoe, your shoe needs to fit 3 major requirements. There's more that we could talk about here, but 3 major ones. First of which is minimal material separating your foot from the floor to maximize proprioception, to maximize your ability to connect with the floor. The second of which is they are flat to the floor. Absolutely no toe lift, which is very, very common. And then the third of which is going to be they have a wide enough toe box to allow your foot to splay and root effectively. If the toe box is so narrow that it grabs your feet and twists them into a bunch, how in the actual hell are you supposed to root effectively? You're dead upon arrival simply because of shoe wear. Now, another important note is a lot of people go with a very classic chuck to lift in. And I understand why. Aesthetically, it's very pleasing. It's kind of appealing to where strength sports, especially powerlifting, started, right? It's almost like the entry equipment you need to start powerlifting. I had that phase myself, but what I had happen in that phase is terrible rooting for 2 primary reasons. One, they are not flat to the floor. Actually, all 3 of these categories I kind of fail on, but there's 2 in particular that's worth mentioning. First of which is they aren't flat to the floor. Chucks have this huge toe lift. If your toes are off the floor, how the hell are you supposed to root effectively? Because a goal of rooting is to have even load and weight distribution throughout the entirety of your foot, right? We have to splay, we have to connect with the floor and distribute weight evenly throughout our foot. That's what's required to have optimal force production and stability upstream. But if your toes are lifted off the floor, how the hell are you supposed to do that? You're dead upon arrival. But the second issue is the toe box is incredibly narrow. It is so narrow. You have no ability to splay your feet. Absolutely no ability to splay your feet. So chucks, very popular shoe wear. They aren't as bad as a running shoe, let's say, a really fat-soled running shoe, but they're still pretty bad. They're far from optimal, to say the least. So with this being said, for lifters out there that struggle with rooting, that are wearing shoes like this, first off, get the hell out of those shoes. If you have to wear shoes, there's brands I can suggest to you. Go with a minimalist style shoe. We'll get into a little bit more nuance here in a second. But the second of which is, the first suggestion I would give you actually is going to be barefoot. Squat barefoot. This is going to be great for assessment, great for proprioception, but also great for learning how to root and cue rooting more effectively. Assessment is the big benefit. Whenever I do an in-person consultation with a new lifter, I always have them squat barefoot to start, simply because it's amazing what you can see within their foot. You can see that they're not splaying at all. They don't know how to splay. You can see that they're actually pronating ever so slightly in a way you couldn't see with a normal shoe. So for assessment reasons, for rooting reasons, go barefoot. And if you need to wear shoes at your gym or in competition, eventually get shoes that are more so minimalist style. But the caveat with minimalist style is that some people's feet need different kinds of minimalist style. So there's one shoe in particular, for example, Notorious Lifts. I really like them. I like the brand. I like the people that make them. But the caveat is I have a fat foot. So though they are more so minimalist, they're not minimalist enough for me. They're not wide enough of a toe box for me. My foot is still cramped as hell. So though it is a shoe that fulfills the requirement of minimalist, it's still not ideal for myself and many lifters out there. You need a shoe that's wide enough for your specific foot, which may mean that it requires a little bit of trial and error to find the ideal one for you for lifting. Now, also understand your feet adapt to the environment that they're actually in. This is actually very important, and it brings up another discussion topic I want to get into. Your foot adapts to the environment it's in, which is why if you see lifters or people that are stuck in extremely tight, narrow shoes, their foot will form to those shoes. This is not pseudoscience. This is not like hooey kind of talk here. It is objective. It is proven. It's been seen time after time. The most egregious examples that are kind of stark opposites is one, ballerinas. Ballerinas that have been stuck in those tiny shoes for years upon years upon years. Their feet has adapted to them, and their foot, not to be mean, not to be rude, but it is relevant, kind of looks like a balled up fist, in all honesty. it formed to the shoe. It formed to the shoe because they're stuck in the shoes all the time. And the opposite end of the spectrum, when people go and they see tribes that have never worn shoes in their entire life, their foot looks like a hand, like a splayed out hand. It's unbelievably wider. Their toes are resting in a more splayed position, and they have the ability to splay even more, to grip things even better. They have a fundamentally different foot that adapted to its environment. And for me personally, for the longest time, I wore Chucks to lift, and then I wore terrible shoes to walk around in every day. And my foot, I had constant knee pain, had terrible balance, couldn't stand on one foot, for example, to save my life. My foot was kind of balled up like this. When I converted to minimalist style shoes, both in training and then also in my everyday life, I physically saw my foot change shape. It was freaky. I'm not sure if you've ever seen your foot rather, go through hypertrophy, but it is cool to see. Not the prettiest thing in the world, but it's very cool to see. So my foot function got better, certain pains went away, my ability to root got a lot better, but my foot literally changed shape because your foot adapts to its environment, and there's thousands of people that could attest to the exact same thing. So also understand that, which kind of brings up the conversation topic of, even if you're trying to maximize your ability to root and lift safely, especially squatting, deadlifting, whatever it may be, consider wearing minimalist in everyday life as well. Because in training, if you wear minimalist style shoes, you'll have the opportunity to do it better in training. But if in your everyday life for 18 other hours a day, you just stick yourself in this terrible shoe, your foot's still going to be adapted to the environment you put it in for the most part of the day. So I would also suggest going minimalist style throughout the day. That's really the biggest bang for your buck. Though there is an adaptation process to cover there, we won't get too into. But if you're wearing these shoes that are just crunching and killing your foot function, and that's all you've ever known, don't go to a minimalist style shoe 100% of the time like that. There's a progression and adaptation period you have to go through to avoid pain or injury when you first get into them, because your foot is going to be required to work a lot harder and just be in a different environment as to adapt to over time. So that about covers it for the feet. The last thing I want to talk about is going to be how we cue optimal rooting. So there's this video here I really like to show, as it's a fantastic example, but if you are somebody that struggles with rooting, I can guarantee you won't be able to do this. This is a good visual representation of what it should look like. But a simple two-step process to cue rooting is going to be 1, splay your feet. 2, the short foot cue. We do not love the eagle claw. We do not love the even grabbing the floor with your foot can get dicey at times, because what people oftentimes do is they splay their foot, and then when they go to do the eagle claw, they curl their feet up. They decrease the surface area surface contact their foot has with the floor, and this actually isn't what we want. This video shows really well what we want. So let's actually watch this together. So that is the short foot. What you'll notice is the intrinsic musculature within the foot had to suction cup to the floor, but the toes didn't curl. Very big difference between it. So the way that I like to cue this, maybe individual to the person, is first splay, second short foot cue. Don't curl the toes, instead use the intrinsic musculature to suction cup to the floor. And just like that, you have the best connection possible with the floor itself, and upstream structures are going to benefit massively from this. That about covers it for the lecture portion. Now we're gonna get into the practical application side of things, my absolute favorite. Let's go ahead and kind of do an overview of what we'll be covering. So first and foremost, there's one specific lift that we can show these principles best with, and that is the squat, the most functional movement pattern out there, and the one that people tend to struggle with the most. Faults are happening left and right, and it demonstrates these principles really well within the application side of things. So we're going to use that as the example. We'll go through first positional faults, second, breathing and bracing faults, third, hinging faults, and then fourth is going to be rooting. We'll talk about why these things are important. We'll show the most common faults in association with it, and then go through drills that's going to help it. Now, first we'll go through in-movement fixes. In-movement fixes, because if you do not have to regress, if you can fix the problem in the movement itself, you always should. Quick reminder there. Second, we're going to go if regression is needed. Here's our favorite regressions to fix the problem itself. Then we're going to go into some warm-up selection suggestions as far as the drills you can choose to potentiate your ability to move more effectively in the squat itself. And then lastly, we'll go through almost like case study examples of showing a lifter that has a slew of different faults, and I'm going to ask you the question of what should we address first, and then we'll go through what I would bias towards as far as addressing this first, this second, this third, and seeing the typical result of those changes. Let's get into it. Our favorite regression for breathing and bracing issues is actually going to be dead bugs. We are the company that talks about dead bugs nonstop, but it's for a very good reason, because for a lot of lifters out there, they don't know what it is to have a stacked rib cage over pelvis position, and to do a dead bug correctly or optimally, you're forced into that exact position. So then your body learns what it means to, what it feels like to be in that position, to breathe and brace from that position, but to stabilize that position. Then from there, we can start to challenge it more and more and more, and there's a high amount of specificity and carryover to squat, deadlift, and things of that nature. And we're going to show you today, starting off with a very regressed version, pretending we have a lifter that doesn't even know what this position is. The lifters that often are stuck in like hyperkyphosis or stuck in that like extended like position. A lot of people like that really need to start here. So we're going to start in the most regressed version and then progress to harder ones that increase the demand of IEP, increase the difficulty to maintain position in the dead bug, and this is going to be a really good way to potentiate our breathing, bracing, and overall trunk stability prior to getting under the barbell. But furthermore, more loaded versions is a great way to actually create strength adaptations, but we should save those towards the end of training. Potentiation work and warm-up is meant to do just that, potentiate, not so much tire them out, because that can actually do the exact opposite. But let's go ahead and actually get into it. Starting off the most regressed version, feet supported dead bug. Let's get into it, Connor. All right, so typically what we would have Connor do is do this where his feet are supported by a bench. We don't have a bench today, so my arm is going to be the bench. Connor's going to get into a perfect dead bug position, and then we're going to have his feet actually support him. Now from here, he is forced into a perfect stacked rib cage over pelvis position. So from here, he can practice his breathing, his bracing, while being forced into a position that's absolutely ideal for it. So from here, you can also give a little bit of a tactile stimulus. He can just relax here statically and give him a tactile stimulus to slowly breathe into. Beautiful, encouraging him to relax. We can also have him just stabilize by bracing. We can do this a few different ways. Again, doing this from a position we should be in, always learning what that is. Now from here, we can actually increase the stabilization demands by taking the support out of the equation. He's still just going to hold this statically. We're not going to add any movement yet, but instead we just increase the demand slightly to maintain this position, and from here we can continue to slowly breathe, brace, and maintain this position as we actually do so. Now, once we've mastered this, we can add a little bit more difficulty by adding movement, but the caveat is we're not going to jump right into the contralateral or ipsilateral versions of movement. Instead, we just move one limb at a time. Let's start with the arm. Any arm you want, slowly move it. Keep in mind to move our extremities, especially as they get further and further towards our base, we increase intra-abdominal pressure demands as we do so. So you can simply move arms, simply move a leg, and that's all we need to do to start to increase the demands put on the body to maintain spine neutrality. A great way to potentiate things that won't tire that musculature out too much. Now, we can also get into contralateral versions, which I absolutely love. But here's the problem. Oftentimes, people will go through extension or positional deviations that are so small, it's impossible to see with the naked eye, and the lifter themselves never notice that they're going through this, especially when you have a lifter that has a deeply ingrained bias. And sorry, you can relax actually. I'm making him hold this through this entire conversation. Especially when a lifter has a heavy bias towards anterior pelvic tilt. That's what they're used to. So the second they get in this dead bug position, they're used to being there, stabilizing from there. So they end up getting in that position without even knowing it. And even if you have a camera angle like this, sometimes it's so minimal you can't see it. Even a coach can't see it sometimes. So to keep them honest, which I actually don't love that term, it's less of an honesty issue, more of a knowledge issue or noticing you're going through this faults issue. To keep them there though, let's go ahead and use this guy right here. This is a golden piece of equipment that costs practically nothing. Everybody should have. But what Connor's gonna do, he's gonna do a sit-up real quick. And the first thing he's gonna do is he's gonna grab this strap on each end, put it behind his back, and then position it under his last rib. So take some time to do that for me, Connor. I'll have you hold there for a second. We should always start like this. A lot of people, for reasons I don't quite understand in all honesty, will actually like throw the band down and then lay back. Actually, sit up for me one more time. We'll stay there for just a second. A lot of people throw the band down and then try to lay back and then try to adjust it as it's there. Don't like that at all. So instead, to find the perfect position, because his position's rather important here, he's just going to slide it back and forth, find that last rib, go just under it, and then once he has that position, he's going to slowly lay back. Always start out that way. Very important. Now from here, what he can do is he's going to give this just a little bit of tension to start. We can actually increase it as we go here, but a little tension to start. And then as he goes through his extension, as he goes through actual movement, it's going to force him to maintain neutrality, because here's the deal. If he goes into the slightest semblance of anterior pelvic tilt, that strap moves out from under him immediately. So through every single one of these variations, whether you're moving an arm, holding it statically, going through contralateral movement, which let's go and show an example of. This is where we get a little bit harder contralateral extension here, beautiful. As we go through all these variations, this right here is crucial for somebody that doesn't know how to get into and maintain this position while going through stabilization demands of our actual lifts. Now you can go ahead and relax from here, Connor. Just one more thing to say, we can add some load as well. If you add load doing this, make it incredibly minimal, assuming it's prior to training. But if you really want to challenge the musculature and receive an adaptable stimulus, then we can add quite a bit of load, but do it towards the end of training, such as, let's say, a 15, 25 pound weight, doing that same contralateral extension with load, which is going to increase the demands of stabilization substantially and produce a very meaningful stimulus to adapt to. As I covered in the lecture portion, it is crucial for a lifter to be able to create a 360 sheath of both inflation and rigidity. But a very common issue is the lifter will lack the motor control to produce that eccentric activation within very specific facets of their trunk. Keep in mind, we're trying to create that guy wire system. So if you look at a guy wire system, it doesn't just happen in the front, not just on the sides, but in a 360 sheath, and we are trying to create the same thing for us internally. But if we miss, let's say, the posterior portion of our trunk, which is incredibly common, then all of a sudden we don't have the same stability, and a slew of downstream faults can happen because of it. I would argue that the most common three examples of this is, number one, at the top, just fundamentally lacking the posterior portion of the trunk. A close second is a bilateral discrepancy or asymmetry within the posterior trunk, where right side expands and creates rigidity beautifully, and the left side, nothing's happening. It's non-existent. And then the third is going to be a lateral portion, which we'll cover here a little bit later. But this drill is going to potentiate the posterior portion, the most common issue. Let's go ahead and get into it, the banded sphinx. So Connor is going to go ahead and wrap this band around the posterior portion of his trunk under the last rib. Important caveat, you look at this band, it's pretty damn thick, as it's supposed to be. Do not go with too light of a band. Now, I'm going to actually have you turn a little bit, Connor, this way. Beautiful. That way you can see the band flex out a little bit. Now from here, he's going to actively press his hand on the floor, kind of get nice and tall, neutral spine position. And then from here, we can go through several different versions of this drill. Oftentimes, the most common limiter is just the muscular co-contraction. So he can relax completely, not breathe necessarily, but just brace into it for me real hard. Beautiful. And as he does so, he is not going to go into posterior pelvic tilt, flex his spine, nothing of that nature. He stays neutral, stays in the same position, and is just relying on those posterior stabilizers to press outward like that. Beautiful. Let's do it one more time. Excellent. Now, relax completely for me. We can also practice the posterior inflation with the breath as well. This gets pretty tough because a lot of lifters will deviate position due to trying to chase and win the drill. We're not trying to win the drill. We're just trying to get a little bit more awareness to this particular section. So Connor's going to relax completely, then just slowly breathe into this band. The key word there is slow. I would suggest a 4 to 5 second inhale, a few second hold, 4 to 5 second exhale, a few second hold, and repeat. And lastly, I really like to do this with the totality of trunk stability required for a heavy 1 rep max squat. So he's going to brace a little bit, breathe into that brace, and brace once more, creating the utmost stability while continuously feeling this right here, that R&T stimulus that helps improve awareness before getting under the bar and improving our trunk stability, which again, the most important foundation of axial loaded movement. When shoulder mobility is a limitation, it is primarily due to lacking the external rotation and flexion demands that's put on us from a back squat. And when we lack that, we are forced into positional deviations that we are dead upon arrival when it comes to stabilizing our trunk fully. So we have to mobilize prior to getting under the bar. There is a slew of drills we could cover today. We're just going to cover a few of our favorite. I typically bias towards the wall angel. This is a slight deviation of that called the floor angel, which works just as well. Let's go ahead and get into it. So Connor, do me a favor, get in position for me. Now, the first thing we're going to cover here is going to be the differentiation, person to person, within hip height. Everybody will have to lift their hips up likely at least a little bit, but the primary principle to this is the number one killer of all shoulder mobility and core training drills is anterior pelvic tilt. When we go into anterior pelvic tilt, especially with a drill like this, all of a sudden the carryover is practically non-existent. So as Connor lifts these hips up, he's going to actively focus on drawing his ribcage down, staying braced, and maintaining neutrality. Then from here, he's also going to focus on actively pressing the entirety of his arm into the floor. It is really easy to just kind of barely touch and not get jack shit out of this. So instead, he's going to actively drive into the floor with the entire arm, including his wrists and his hands the best of his ability, and then slowly do the classic angel. Now, my bias when doing this is to actually have a differentiation within speed, depending upon the point in which you're at in the movement itself. As we go higher, I like to go a little bit faster just because it has the least effect. And then as he goes down lower, I like to slow down, retract the hardest, and if anything, pause at end range at the very bottom, since that's the exact positional demands we are trying to actually train. But again, as he does so, really avoiding any semblance of anterior pelvic tilt, because it is very common. Connor, go ahead and show it. Hate to see it. Exactly. Now, when you do that, what happens, Connor?
I can go a lot further.
Yeah, we can go all day the second that anterior pelvic tilt happens. If you're not challenging the body the same, therefore there's no carryover. So make sure we keep this rigid, keep this neutral, and go through it just as described. Now, sometimes when shoulder mobility is a limitation to position in the back squat, it actually has less to do with mobility and more to do with a certain musculature in a hypertonic state, beat to hell, really beat up. A really common example of this is when somebody bench presses really heavy the day before squat session, 2 days, 3 days, whatever it may be. Pecs are extremely bound up. There's like 3 or 4 muscle groups that are very commonly really bound up, and they're the biggest limiter towards getting into an ideal back squat position. Now, today I want to run through just a few very basic but profound drills to improve that and get you into a better position. And Kyle's full-on course that goes incredibly in-depth towards every single muscle group, every single tissue intervention method you can possibly think of. I would definitely bias towards watching that. For today, we're just going to include the 2 most relevant drills. The first of which is going to be the Vice method. I absolutely love this guy. All we need is a Acu ball and a boomstick. But here's the thing. If you don't have these 2 things, not a big deal, really not a big deal. These are ideal. These are certainly ideal, but you can do the same thing using a lacrosse ball and a handle of a kettlebell. It works too. Is it as comfortable? Is it as productive? Definitely not, but it still accomplishes a whole lot. So let's go ahead and show that first. Connor, do me a favor, get into position. And what he's going to do is he's going to have that Acu ball dig right into his rear delt. I'll warn you right now, this sucks. This absolutely sucks. Feels good afterwards, but it's not fun to do. It's very painful. But he's going to dig it into a perfect spot on his rear delt, and then he's going to hold this boomstick and place it in the spot on his pec that is the most beat up or the most tense, the most painful. He's going to find a really, really bad spot. Now, from here, he's going to go through several movements. I like to start off with external rotation, and then come right back to that neutral position. We're gonna go nice and slow. The range of motion does not have to be huge. We just have to get that muscle to fire a little bit while digging into it. So he's gonna go through that. I bias towards anywhere from 8 to 10 times. And then once he's done with that, he can do a really, really externally rotated overhead press. So he kind of externally rotates maximally and then goes through something close to an overhead press kind of motion. And he's gonna do that another 8 to 10 times, typically going through 2 to 3 different movements. It's highly specific to the demands we're trying to adapt to. Is fantastic. Last note here is I really like to bias towards 3 different trouble spots per muscle group. So once he's done with this, he's going to, if you need to, palpate a little bit, find the next really, really tough spot, and then bias the boomstick point towards that next spot and go through the exact same thing. And then find the next worst spot, going through 3 different spots, same exact motion, and by the time it's all said and done, that bad boy is cleaned up and position gets exponentially better. Another really good example that you need less equipment for is going to be the shoulder rock version. Let's go and get into that. And lastly, the shoulder rock version. So we're going to do basically the same thing, the same movements, the same spots, but we're simply going to lean over the top of a shoulder rock. The shoulder rocks, especially the newer ones, have this beautiful end to it that's fantastic for tissue work, and this specifically is actually my favorite way to apply it. So Connor's going to get into a staggered stance and lean over the top of it, and from here he's going to dig into, again, the toughest, most painful spot, and then go through those exact same movements, starting off with the external rotation, return back to neutral. Only need a little bit of movement. We're really just trying to get that muscle to fire. And then once he's done with that 8 to 10 times, he can go ahead and just go overhead press, nice and slow. And then once he gets done with that spot, he can do 2 other spots that are very troublesome. That's really all there is to it. This is actually my favorite one to do. It's a little bit easier. You don't have to get on the ground, requires less equipment. Very, very efficient way to take care of this very prevalent issue. Now let's get into the practical application side of things. We're going to cover every major fault we see. Not all the faults, of course, because there's so many. This would be an entire 20+ hour course in itself. We're going to cover the major ones that we see most commonly, and then show how the principles we previously covered can be applied to addressing said faults in the most efficient manner possible. Now, as mentioned previously, there's going to be 4 distinct categories of faults that we cover. Really trying to minimize this as much as possible to simplify it. The first of which is going to be positional faults. The second of which is going to be breathing, bracing, trunk stability. The third of which is going to be rooting and foot ankle complex. And the last is going to be hinging. If lifters get rid of all 4 of these categories and work to optimize it, it is amazing how many progressions or improvements the lifter can have. But we're going to start with positional faults for one specific reason, and that is they happen first and they make the lifter dead upon arrival as far as setting breathing, bracing, spine mechanics, as well as rooting optimally, hinging optimally. When somebody has a positional fault, let's say in the on-rack, everything is dead upon arrival. That lifter just shot himself in the foot prior to even squatting in the first place. The 2 most common examples of positional faults that limit a lifter are 1, anterior pelvic tilt. So Connor, stand to the side here, show that bad boy for me. Classic anterior pelvic tilt, that open scissor position. Keep in mind, if we do not have the stacked rib cage over pelvis position, our diaphragm can no longer approximate and depress towards the pelvic floor in the same way. And due to this, intra-abdominal pressure creation opportunity goes down drastically. And I would say the second most common positional fault is more of a like kyphosis sort of posture. So forward head position, elbows pitched out a little bit if we're talking about the context of a squat, but this is the posture we want to avoid come hell or high water, yet is extremely common even in very high level lifters. Now that posture in particular, this is going to be an entire presentation in itself, so I won't get too deep into the nitty gritty here, but when it comes to a short duration forward head position, this is going to mitigate your ability to utilize the diaphragm fully, just like the anterior pelvic tilt example. This has actually been studied quite extensively, and for the first time ever, there's a recent study that specifically measured the short-term forward head position in healthy participants, and what they found was something that many people expected to be found, which was there was a immediate decrease in their ability to fully utilize the diaphragm. And because of that, we really want to avoid this in any kind of axial loaded movement when we go to breathe and brace. So when somebody unracks, when somebody walks out, when somebody goes to go through their stability sequence prior to squatting, we need to be tall, we need to be neutral. Any of this, any of that, any of the anterior pelvic tilts, and again, we are immediately going to minimize our ability to handle load and do so safely. Let's cover the major positional faults first, starting off with the unrack, getting into some stability concerns, and then lastly, the walkout, the unsung heroes of the squat, the things that never get talked about yet should be talked about all the time, as faults around here are very common. So Connor, go ahead and get under the barbell for me. Now, Before he unracks, what we need to do is go through our stability sequence or cadence of cues to create the utmost stability in the trunk and the lats in every single major structure. Here's the thing though, a lot of lifters are very lackadaisical about getting under the bar and even more so the unrack itself. So Connor here is going to be showing a very common fault where he is loose as a goose, he has no trunk stability, no lat engagement, and because of that, as he unracks, he's going to have a forward head position, elbows typically pitch out pretty aggressively. We can get even more aggressive than that. Beautiful. That's an absolute shit show of a position. Don't get me wrong, you can handle some decent load, but it's far from optimal or far from a position you can demonstrate your full strength. So what he's going to do instead, re-rack it for me, Connor. The immediate in-movement fix we can go through to fix this is going to be going through that stability sequence. So what Connor is going to do is he's going to brace, breathe brace. He's going to create the utmost trunk stability. He's going to use his lats to drive his elbows down to press the scapula. And then from here, unrack, stand tall. And just like that, there is no positional loss during the unrack. Very simple fix, but believe it or not, this is an extremely common issue where people don't go through that stability sequence prior to unracking. The second most common positional limitation issue is going to be poor unrack mechanics. Sometimes lifters do a really good job of creating stability initially, but the actual mechanics they use to unrack is just awful. The most common of which being not using the hip extensors and not getting tall within the head position. And it typically looks a little something like this. Beautifully terrible. Okay, so what you'll notice is, if Connor does this one more time and hold position, I know it feels awful, what you'll notice is he didn't use his hip extensors. People do this all the time where they unrack like this here. They have so much hip flexion, a forward head position, elbows pitched down, absolute shit show because their mechanics are very poor to unrack it. So he's going to re-rack here, and what he's going to focus on doing is two particular things to improve his unrack mechanics. He's going to focus on squeezing his glutes and packing his head like this here, and just like that, he's in a tall, beautiful position. Show it one more time, Connor. Gorgeous. And from here, it's his responsibility to maintain this as he walks out. So that's the second most common reason why people lose position, poor unrack mechanics, and that's the number one way people create poor unrack mechanics. Now, there are some additional things such as foot position being very poor. Some people have their foot position too far out in front of them, too far back. This also creates limitations, but just know that we need to fully create our stability, go through its sequence, and we need to as we unrack it nice and tall. The third most common example is during the walkout. This is incredibly common. There is a half a dozen plus faults we could go over here, but Connor, show me position loss during the walkout. Beautifully terrible. If you see this position here, again, that kyphosis-like posture, forward head position, elbows pitched out, very, very poor position. And this happened during the actual walkout. The unrack was beautiful, stability sequence is beautiful, but because he took too far of a first step and didn't maintain stability, he had severe positional consequences. And unfortunately, once you get into this position, we can't reclaim it with heavier load. So Connor, what I'm gonna have you do is re-rack it for me, and we're gonna go through the 3-step cadence to walk out. This is very, very important. The big mistake Connor made that was kind of a conduit to having those positional faults was that he took too big a first step, he took too many steps, and he didn't maintain the stability with his trunk and his lats and his upper back. So what he's going to do is he's going to breathe, brace, stabilize, unrack, stand tall, squeeze glutes, get tall. And then from here, he's going to take a 3-step walkout. No step is too big, incredibly slow. And then his third step gets him into his ideal squat stance. You'll notice there's not a semblance of positional loss. From here, he has a stacked rib cage over pelvis position where he can breathe and brace fully, he can root effectively, and go through ideal squat mechanics. So those are the most common positional limitations that we see, and those are a number of ways that people get into this forward head position, elbows pitched out, or anterior pelvic tilt like position. Later on in this, we'll talk about how people enter that because of hinging faults, but in movement fixes for that are going to be improving stability sequence prior to the unrack, improving unrack mechanics, and improving walkout mechanics. But there's one issue we have not touched on yet, and that is sometimes lifters are dead upon arrival when it comes to having an ideal upper body position simply because of shoulder mobility deficits or a certain muscle being in a hypertonic, bound up state. So we're gonna go ahead and go over some tissue work to help address that root cause, as well as some of our favorite mobility drills to improve shoulder mobility for the specific demands placed upon it during a barbell back squat, especially a low bar barbell back squat. So my personal favorite drill, my absolute go-to, is the banded overhead R&T squat. This is incredibly beneficial for a lifter, and another reason I kind of like it is because it even has a lifter squatting. So if you're somebody that normally does a goblet squat, let's say, this can kind of replace both a goblet squat and get some shoulder mobility prep prior to squatting, kill two birds with one stone, make that warm up a little bit more efficient. So what Connor's going to do, first off, you can notice we have a 2-band setup here. Connor's going to go ahead and grab each individual band with one hand, walk back just a hair, and get into his normal squat stance. From here, he's going to get into an overhead squat position. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people chase range of motion here. I gotta be honest, I don't give a shit about range of motion. I typically bias towards a third range of motion, right? So what he's gonna do is actually separate his hands just a little bit at the top, beautiful. And throughout this, he's gonna actively pull back against it. He's gonna try to maintain trunk position, squat about a third range of motion, come up from there. But here's the important note. At the top of every single rep, he reinforces position. It sucks, and it seems like something you may not need to do, but I promise you, you need to do it. A few more times, Connor. Beautiful. Reinforces every time. He's maintaining trunk stability, maintaining spine neutrality. Keep in mind, if he goes into anterior pelvic tilt, very little carryover will happen. Lastly, Connor, show anterior pelvic tilt. Exactly. That makes it easier, but that also makes the carryover absolute dog shit. Now let's go and get into breathing and bracing faults, or trunk stabilization faults. So there's 4 in particular we're going to cover. My goodness, is there so many more we could cover, but the ones we're really going to touch on today, the most common ones that we see, are going to be, first off, a vertical breath, a compensatory breathing strategy. Second off, lacking the 360 sheath of inflation or rigidity. The third of which is going to be posterior pelvic tilt or pelvic deviations when somebody actually goes to brace. And the fourth of which is going to be concentric activity of the trunk stabilizers instead of eccentric activation. Those are the 4 main faults. We're going to show those and talk about both the in-movement fixes as well as regression fixes. Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, now first we're going to show the vertical breath fault, but to show it really well, Connor's going to face it the wrong way. I gotta admit, I hate having anybody unrack like this, but for example's sake, we're just going to go ahead and do it. So Connor's going to unrack and walk forward. I know it's annoying, but he is going to walk forward. Beautiful. Now from here, he's going to relax completely, then give me the most Kirby-style compensatory breathing mechanism possible. Give it to me, Connor. Beautiful. So relax here for just a second. When we breathe, we want to see horizontal expansion, not vertical expansion. Now there's a long laundry list of reasons why. I could go down as to why this is, but to put it very simply, it's because to maximize intra-abdominal pressure, we have to breathe horizontally. When we see these big compensatory vertical breathing patterns, a few different issues happen. The biggest of which is oftentimes it gets so bad that people literally enter anterior pelvic tilt as they do so. But a more nuanced reason is that when somebody breathes vertically like that, the central tendon of their diaphragm moves anteriorly. When it moves anteriorly, it is no longer perfectly lined up with the pelvic floor. As I mentioned previously, these two structures have to be lined up directly over the top of one another to generate IEP fully. We move that central tendon anteriorly, they are no longer lined up vertically, over the top of one another. So because of that, IAP opportunity goes down, which is a big issue. And the next fault we see is the concentric activity brace compensatory mechanism to brace. So this is actually very common as well, where somebody will look like a bodybuilder doing a vacuum pose to create trunk rigidity, which is actually the exact opposite, the stark opposite of what we want to actually see. So Connor, go ahead and show that for me. When you go to brace, exactly, we see the sucking in instead of the expanding out. We are trying to create a cylinder of pressure, a soda can of pressure, a guy wire system. But the second we suck in like that, we do the exact opposite. This is the last thing we want to see under loading conditions. So that's a second fault. The third of which is going to be posterior pelvic tilt or pelvic deviations when they go to brace. So Connor, show that the best you can here. Tuck that pelvis actually as you brace. Beautiful. Stand nice and tall. Do it one more time for me. just like that. Standing from the side, I might be able to show this a little bit better. Connor, feel free to relax and unrack that, or re-rack that bad boy. But from the side here, you'll notice that is what we're trying to avoid. That posterior pelvic tuck as somebody goes to brace, it's a very common compensatory mechanism to set trunk stability. Oftentimes looking like this with posterior pelvic tilt, as well as head position coming just a little bit forward, like a crunch. And this oftentimes stems from a hyper focus on the anterior portion of our trunk, creating stability from there. I can do so artificially just by crunching, but the caveat is very inactive in the posterior, and it's positional deviations that allows us, or does not allow us, to stabilize fully. Now for the last fault I want to show, I'm going to have Connor unrack and walk out properly, and we're going to talk about the 360 sheath of inflation and rigidity. Beautiful, nice unrack there. Now you'll notice Connor's in a very nice position here. He should be able to inflate and brace beautifully, but very, very common. If you were to palpate or look very closely at the posterior portion of the trunk, when he goes to breathe, when he goes to brace, there's nothing happening back here. Oftentimes only action is happening in the anterior portion, the front of their trunk, and very little to nothing is happening in the posterior. Or another common example is a bilateral imbalance or asymmetry within their ability to stabilize back here. I don't want to cover up the camera angle, but usually I would be here feeling this, a thumb on each side. So we're going to go ahead and feel on each side, and as he goes to breathe and brace, what you'll feel is one side goes out beautifully, the other side's completely inactive. These are all major issues. Now let's go ahead and talk about in-movement fixes for these very common faults. There's some fantastic regressions we can use, but again, I will reiterate this: when you can fix the problem in the movement itself, you always should. So Connor, I'm going to have him unrack and walk out, but facing forward. I know it's annoying and you don't like it, but we're going to be able to show some better details. So Connor is going to unrack, walk out for me, and then chill right there. So first and foremost, one of the most powerful things that we can do is actually going to be tactile cueing. So when he goes to breathe and brace, prior to him breathing and bracing, one of the most powerful things I can do is actually provide him a tactile stimulus to breathe and brace into. So if he was having the issue of vertical breathing, I'd likely give him both a mental cue and a physical cue. So what I'd have him do is I'd actually have him close his eyes and tell him, pretend you're filling a pitcher of water from the bottom of your stomach up, nice and slowly. And you'll notice my voice when I say that is actually very, very calm, because I'm actually trying to get him to relax. A lot of people, the biggest driver to vertical compensatory breathing patterns is that they are very excited. They have a hard time calming down, and calming down is a big part of this. I'm going to have him calm down, close his eyes, get less stimuli through visual, and then from here, I'm going to give him a tactile cue. I'm going to have him fill up nice and slow, bottom up, and I'm going to add in, okay, now breathe into my thumb nice and slowly. Now, ideally, as he's doing this, I'm really looking for the parts of his trunk, parts of that 360 sheath that he's lacking the most. So I'm also getting the posterior. I'm going to continue to have him do this and say, find my thumb, find my thumb. I'm going to poke in pretty deeply. Find my thumb for me. Beautiful, and relax. Now we're going to show the same thing from the back. This is actually the most common limitation lifters have. So again, I am going to actually assess and provide him a tactile feedback to breathe and brace into my thumbs. It is amazing how much we can do in the movement itself simply by doing this and having him close his eyes and simply find my thumb, breathe into my thumb, brace into my thumb. That's really all we need to create a really positive change to his 360 sheath of rigidity. Two more things I want to show in the movement itself. This is going to be an RNT drill, one that I absolutely love. It's most beneficial for people that lack the ability to utilize the lateral portions of their trunk, but we can use it for the posterior as well. We can use it for the anterior as well. So before he gets under the bar, I'm going to have him unrack and walk out like a normal person, facing the right way. But before he does so, I'm going to have him wear this guy right here. Now, I'm assuming he has a deficit within the lateral portion of his trunk. If he does, I'm going to give him a really good amount of tension, have him unrack, walk out. And now from here, I'm going to have him breathe and brace into this band and relax. Slowly breathe and brace in this band and relax. One more time for me, Connor.
Beautiful. Now stay there. I can also do the same thing, but give him tension on the posterior portion of his trunk, specifically on the left side. So I can pull it really hard and give him that same tactile stimulus across the back just with this band here. Beautiful. So we can do that for every single section of the trunk when we want to focus on in-movement fixes using an R&T stimulus coming in the form of band. And lastly, let's cover the benefits of using a belt. There's a lot of misunderstandings when it comes to the belt, but as far as a tactile stimulus to breathe and brace better, it's actually one of the most robust effects you can get when it comes to learning how to do so better in the squat itself. But let's go ahead and go into a little bit of what a belt actually is meant to do. A belt is not a crutch. It is not meant to be a passive means of stability. Instead, it's an active means of additional stability you have to work for. But it also provides that tactile stimulus to breathe and brace better in a 360 sheath. So for example, when a lifter has on a belt, closes his eyes and thinks about just inflating and bracing into the back of the belt, that can be a terrific benefit to their ability to utilize that section better. Or another one of my favorites is the lateral portions on both sides. Having a belt on and thinking about breathing and bracing to lateral portions of the belt, really fantastic way to fix the problem in the movement itself. So Connor's going to throw on a belt right now. And as you can see, by simply wearing this belt, he has a really good stimulus to work against. The one caveat is most lifters in general put their belt on too tight. And if you're already struggling with breathing and bracing, I always bias towards a looser setting, a setting to where you can stick 2 fingers between your belt and your stomach sideways. So Connor's going to make sure it's loose enough to do so. And then from here, once again, he can breathe and brace into this bad boy, receiving the tactile benefits associated with an actual belt. The last thing I want to cover here, though, is going to be a kind of creative drill we came up with a while back that does wonders for focusing on very specific facets of trunk stability. So let's say the lateral most portion he's having a hard time with inflating and creating rigidity against. I can take a towel or even a backpack strap, but a towel is a little bit better of a tactile stimulus. He's going to unlatch that bad boy. I'm going to stick it between his shirt and the belt itself. He's going to put it back on. And now from here, he has just a little bit of extra sensory feedback to breathe and brace into something. And this is just a simple towel you can get anywhere. You can use a few different materials. I'm sure you can use a sweatshirt, a sock, just about anything imaginable, as long as it provides you just a little bit of extra sensory feedback as you go to do so. And then we can do the same thing. Turn sideways for me, Connor. We can do the same thing for the posterior. It's too tight. Actually, unlatch that bad boy for me for just a second. Beautiful. Latch it back up. And again, we can do the same thing for back here. This can provide a really meaningful benefit for him to close his eyes and now breathe and brace into the towel specifically. And the next series of faults, we're going to talk about breathing and bracing. We typically talk about these separately, then discuss how they have an additive effect with one another. But for today's conversation, we're going to talk about them together. We're going to show 4 distinct, very common faults that include a big vertical breath, a lack of ability to expand and create rigidity in that 360 sheath we talked about in the lecture portion. Third, we're going to talk about what happens when we have positional deviations to brace, such as that crunching motion, that posterior pelvic tilt. And then lastly, what happens when we have the vacuuming in, the concentric activity of the trunk stabilizers rather than the eccentric activity that we want to look for. Now, to show the first 2, Connor's going to do something that drives me absolutely crazy. He's going to unrack from the front, walk out forward. But for example's sake, this is going to be exponentially better. So as you'll notice, he'll have a beautiful position to unrack, to walk out in, and this is actually quite common. But then when he goes to actually take in his air, we see this big vertical expansion. Now, there's a number of things that happens that we do not want to see when this takes place. The biggest of which is positional deviations. Now, there's a wide degree of variability when it comes to the severity of this vertical breath. Show just a little bit for me, just a little bit. Exactly. Oftentimes it'll start looking pretty good, but then the last 80% of it gets very vertical. And then other times from the absolute start, it is a shit show. It is as vertical as it can be, so much so, not only do the collarbones move up, not only do the shoulders move up, but even the barbell moves up. And when it gets that severe, we are very concerned from a trunk stability standpoint. Now, when this happens to a high severity, positional deviations happen to where the central tendon of that diaphragm moves anteriorly. Now, what happens when this takes place? The pelvic floor and the rib cage are no longer lined up directly on top of one another. As we covered in the lecture portion, this needs to be stacked to maintain the full opportunity to create intra-abdominal pressure. If they are not stacked, whether it's anterior pelvic tilt, whether that's the central tendon moving anteriorly, whether that's head position way forward, many examples of that nature, when this takes place, that diaphragm does not have the same ability to approximate downwards towards the pelvic floor, therefore stability is lost, or at the very least degraded. So with this being said, when we see this vertical breath, instead what we should see is this beautiful horizontal expansion. Now, I'm going to have him go ahead and stay here as he shows concentric activity. Okay, so oftentimes the breath will actually look pretty good. There's beautiful horizontal inflation, but when he goes to finish it off with that strong muscular co-contraction, we see vacuuming in. Connor, you want to go ahead and show that? Beautiful. One more time for me. There we go. He's sucking in like a bodybuilder. Connor, you can go and rack that and relax. Both of these faults are extremely detrimental because what we want to see is horizontal expansion with the breath, but then further expansion, further intra-abdominal pressure creation when he goes to finish it off with that strong muscular co-contraction. We should see further expansion. Now, the second two faults, we're going to show the correct method of unracking and walking out, and that's going to be the Lacan 360 sheath of stability, oftentimes coming in the form of limitations in the posterior portion. Secondly, the posterior pelvic tilt or crunching motion people bias towards or compensate towards when they don't create stability optimally. So Connor unracks in a beautiful position, walks out. Then once he gets out here, let's go ahead and show first the Lacan 360. So as mentioned prior, the two most common examples, number one is going to be not inflating back here. If he does this optimally, you'll notice my thumbs and fingers actually go out. They should go out quite a bit actually. But sometimes the lifter is so focused in the anterior front portion that this is completely inactive. If you only look at it in the front, it's beautiful expansion. You see nothing wrong with it. But when you look very closely at the back, or better yet, you actually palpate and feel back there, it is completely inactive. Now, sometimes there's also a asymmetry side to side or like a bilateral imbalance. So that's another really common example. If I was assessing this while he was squatting, I'd actually get in a position like this. But for camera angle's sake, I'll just show it like this. Sometimes when he goes to inflate and brace, one side goes out beautifully, the other side completely inactive. And this is going to come with a slew of faults downstream. One of the most common examples of which is a difference in hip height or hip shift. One hip will dip down lower, one knee will cave in to a very severe degree. He'll lack motor control and stability of downstream structures on one side. And that's just a few of a slew of examples that could end up happening if he goes unchecked doing that for long periods of time. There's going to be some really big concerns. So that's the Lacan 360 rigidity example. The last one I want to go through is going to be the crunching motion. A lot of people do not know how to create stability in the trunk without crunching and often even going into posterior pelvic tilt. So without even breathing, Connor, just show me posterior pelvic tilt to brace. Just like that, beautiful. Now, sometimes this even happens, and it's kind of hard to do when you're good at breathing and bracing. Showing bad examples can be really hard, but sometimes this happens to a degree that's actually very subtle. So nothing will happen in the upper body. It'll just be posterior pelvic tilt. Connor, do your best. There it is, beautiful. Relax, show it one more time for me. Just like that, re-rack it and relax. So we definitely do not want to see that. So to recap here, the crunching motion, oftentimes we see upper body positional degradation as well, but sometimes it's so small that you can only see it by very carefully looking at the hips. There's that little bit of posterior pelvic tilt to create rigidity. And it's like an artificial rigidity strategy to where instead of creating that outer sheath without positional change, people just bias towards that crunching motion. Last example of the 360 again is that lateral portion lacking it. So let's go ahead and get into some in-movement drills to fix these very common issues, because you would be surprised at how efficiently we can correct these very common issues simply by providing fixes in the movement itself. But prior to doing that, anything to add there, Connor?
Yes, absolutely. If you have the opportunity to, take your time with your setup. If you speed up through this process, it's going to be that much harder to actually make sure that you are in a good position. You're shooting yourself in the foot if you speed up through this process.
Absolutely. I want to actually add a little bit to that. The tempo is actually rather important. Before I forget to add this is extraordinarily important. There's so many lifters out there that their strategies are rock solid. Everything's looking so stinking good, but when they go to actually squat, they rush the process. It doesn't matter if we're talking about a sumo deadlift setup, a bench press setup, breathing and bracing prior to the eccentric, your stability strategy prior to unracking. If you have troubles with these things, going fast is the worst thing you can do. Speed is earned with time, but realistically, with most of the stuff we talked about, it doesn't have to come in the first place. So don't go fast. Oftentimes, the best suggestion you can give is let's turn that 2-second gasp of air, that Kirby style of breathing, let's turn that into something much, much slower, making the athlete breathe with a 5-count tempo. I know it's hard. You have 400, 500, 600, 700 pounds on your back actively trying to kill you. So I get going slow is a really hard thing, but the more you push yourself to do so, the better opportunity you have to optimize this. Now let's cover in-movement fixes. It is amazing the simplicity you can approach this with and the most robust effects it can actually provide, providing very simple tactile cueing. So we're going to cover some tactile cueing strategies, some band R&T drills, and also some details around how a belt can actually help you significantly with this process, and also some of the fallacies surrounding a belt. We have to include that as there is so many. But to start, we're going to have Connor unrack the correct way, facing away from the camera. He's going to unrack, walk out, beautiful position, and we'll talk about the tactile cueing portion of this. Beautiful. So let's pretend, Connor, let's start with the specific fault of lacking the 360 sheath of stability. So realistically, when it comes to tactile cueing, there's some specific details around where exactly you put your hands, but realistically, when it comes to the vertical breath issue, when it comes to lacking 360 sheath of stability issue, and even when it comes to the concentric sucking in activity of the trunk stabilizers, all three of those from a tactile standpoint can be addressed with a very similar method, and that's simply getting some fingers and thumbs in the area. Now, this is always important to cover, especially if this is a female, but even if it's a male, I am 100% of the time going to ask him, not tell him even, but ask him, hey man, are you okay with myself giving you a tactile stimulus so you have something to work against, a stimulus to work against? So I'll kind of talk about what I'm going to do exactly, how it's going to benefit them, and as long as they're okay with it, then we can move forward with this strategy. But assuming it is okay, I have had that conversation, what I'm going to have him do is, if he's struggling with the vertical breath, I'm simply going to have him, I'm going to combine tactile cueing and mental cueing. So what I'm specifically going to tell him is, I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to fill your stomach like a pitcher of water from the bottom up. Imagine that pitcher starts right around your belt line, right around where your shorts are pulled up to. So start by filling up your shorts as the bottom of the pitcher and slowly work up your stomach. And you'll notice when I say this very calm, because one of the biggest drivers to vertical breathing patterns is them being in a very excited state. That's actually a natural adaptation to being stressed out, having bad posture and other things of that nature that can get rather nuanced rather quickly. We'll save that conversation for another day, but I want them to calm the fuck down. That's actually a really important note here. So when I tell them this stuff, I'm going to use cues that are very calming and relaxing, and I'm also going to have him close his eyes to have less stimuli to focus on and kind of interrupt the process. So once again, I'm going to have him close his eyes, fill that pitcher of water from the bottom up, and then as he actually does so, I may have him do that a time or two without any tactile stimulus, and then as he's doing it as needed, I'm also going to give him some tactile cueing like this. So I'll poke my fingers into his lateral portion of his trunk. My thumbs in the posterior have a heavy bias towards the specific section he may be struggling with. And then from here, I'm going to have him continue to close his eyes, and I'm going to tell him, as you breathe, find my thumb. Find my thumb, okay? I'm going to say, breathe slower, try to give me a 5-second inhale, and as he's doing so, I'm going to wiggle my thumb a little bit and say, find my thumb. And as he does so, it's amazing how much benefit that can have to his ability to inflate the posterior. So simple, it seems like it couldn't work, but I promise you it does. Now that's specifically the breathing aspect of things. I may even have him not breathe at all, not try to maximize IEP, and instead specifically focus on the brace. So let's kind of get into the movement fault of the concentric activity of the stabilizers, that sucking in bodybuilding vacuum kind of bias or compensation. If that's the case, I'm not going to have him focus on breathing at all to start. I want to focus on that 85% of trunk stability as we talked about in the lecture, and I'm going to have him just brace into my thumb. Beautiful, relax for me, brace into my thumb. Beautiful, relax for me. Each time he does it, I'm going to have him hold it for a second or two, and then I'm going to finish this entire process off with, I want you to give me a little bit of a brace in my fingers and thumbs. Breathe into that brace into my fingers and thumbs, then brace once more. Hold that. Then relax. All right, you can go and rack that barbell. Again, so simple. It seems like it wouldn't work, but I promise you it does. Once again, though, I want to have a heavy bias towards the specific facets of trunk stability he's missing. If the breath is where things are going wrong, I'm going to practice the breath. If the brace, such as concentric activity, is where things are going wrong, I'm going to focus on the brace. But then I'm also going to integrate that into the totality of strategy he uses to create trunk stability. We haven't mentioned this yet, but we are not a believer, or not a big believer that is, in the breath, brace, cadence to set trunk stability. We really bias towards the brace, breath, brace for a myriad of different reasons, but to put it very simply, it just does a better job at creating trunk stabilization. And once again, if I know he has a really hard time with the lateral portion, I'm going to bias towards the lateral portion, or the most common example, the posterior portion. Or if we get into that bilateral imbalance, I'm going to not even have my hands on one side, instead have him find my thumb on that right posterior portion that he's specifically struggling with. Myself is a really good example of this. I am a person where that was my exact struggle for the longest time. I had massive hip shift because I lacked that ability. And then working with our clinician, Dr. Philip Snell, that's exactly what he put me through. And it was amazing how short of a time period it took to get my body to have better motor control within utilizing that vital section and creating that 360 sheath, creating that guy wire system internally. The next in-movement fix I want to talk about is a band R&T drill. This is an incredible one, and you can actually set this up in ways to where you don't need a partner, but I'm mainly going to show it from the standpoint of having one and then talk a little bit about how we can set it up on your own. So prior to Connor actually unracking, I can provide something similar to the tactile stimulus, except this one gives a little bit better of a stimulus, especially if you're on your own. You can't necessarily poke yourself in the trunk, but also gives one kind of across the entire section of a trunk rather than a particular part, which can be very appropriate for certain issues, especially, let's say, if you have that lateral oblique issue with inflation, which is another very common example. So that's actually my favorite way to utilize this, is the lateral oblique limitation. So, or the lateral portion of the trunk, the oblique limitation. So with that being said, before Connor unracks, I'm going to go ahead and have him unrack the wrong way from the front. But before he does, I'm going to put this around him, put it right around that oblique, pretend he is having issues with inflating the lateral portion of his trunk. He is going to unrack, walk out, have a beautiful position, and assuming he has limitations here, I'm going to give him a good amount of tension, and now he has that stimulus to breathe and brace into. Beautiful. One more time for me. Excellent. Now I can also bias this towards the posterior. So let's say there's a really big asymmetry. He's having issues in the right portion of the posterior section. I can do the same thing, and now he has that stimulus to work against. The last example I want to give here is if he is on his own, he can tie this to just about anything and then have the same exact effect. Tie it off to the side of the rack, walk out a ways, and he can provide the same stimulus on his own. This is one of my absolute favorites. Next in movement fix I want to talk about is the category of belt. So first, to preface this conversation, understand that there's a lot of fallacies surrounding belt usage. A lot of people consider them to be a passive means of stability. We could not disagree more. They are an active means of additional stability, a opportunity to create the utmost stability. A lot of people don't understand the true purpose of them. To put it very simply, it's just a rigid surface to press into. And when you're having troubles inflating in that 360 sheath, or just having troubles horizontally expanding during your brace or whatever it may be, actually a really good example is the concentric activity, the sucking in. When we wear a belt, we now have a rigid structure all the way around our trunk to cue pressing outward, breathing outward. So if you use the belt correctly, it can be a fantastic fix to these issues. But furthermore, we have to make sure when we put the belt on, we are not wearing it in a detrimental fashion. So as Connor puts this on, he's actually going to wear it a little bit looser than most people would. So understand, as I mentioned prior, speed is earned with time, though it doesn't have to be earned in the first place, with many different concepts around lifting. But a very similar conversation could be had around belts. Tightness is earned with time, but we always want to make sure we don't put it on too tight. I personally would argue for the vast majority of people, you should always have it loose enough to where you can fit 2 fingers in sideways in a relaxed position between the stomach and the belt. That way you have just enough room to expand and brace into it. But let's say you're having issues with these kinds of components, then you should likely wear it a little bit looser, because people's body, they have to go through adaptations to learn how to pressurize against it. It's actually a really hard skill set to get used to initially, so I suggest people wear it looser, then earn the right to make it a little bit tighter throughout time, but keeping in mind that it should never be too tight. There should always be a little bit of room there. But now all of a sudden, Connor, if you kind of pretend you're in a squat position here, now all of a sudden Connor has something to breathe and brace into. And this can be a fantastic way to help with a lot of these issues. And oftentimes I'll still use a lot of the cues that I mentioned previously. So one of my favorite in movement cues is that pitcher of water from the bottom up. So he can actually do that while squatting, close his eyes ideally. Another really good cue is actually drawing his rib cage down, like he's pressing down on a ball of air, a ball of pressure. That's another really good one. Then last really good one I fell in love with lately is breathing into the lateral portions of the belt. If a lifter closes their eyes and just focuses on breathing and bracing into those lateral portions, it can have a weirdly robust effect. But maintaining the belt being on, I want to talk about some additional creative drills I love for these kinds of issues. One of the best of which, in my opinion, is actually utilizing a simple towel. So we can also use a backpack strap. There's the drill that I kind of made up one day, in all honesty, that works really well, where you take a backpack strap, you tie off a weight to it, put it in between. You can find it on a few different places, EDU Plus, my Instagram, but this one is a little bit easier to facilitate simply because everybody has a towel. Not everybody has a backpack strap. So with that being said, if Connor turns aside just a little bit for me, I can actually put this between his belt and his stomach. He can cinch it down, and believe it or not, just having this gives him a little more tactile feedback to specifically breathe and brace into. So if he has that lateral portion issue, this is perfect placement. If he's having more so the posterior issue, then if he turns to the side here and unlatches, we can actually bias this towards the back and then do the exact same thing. Now we can also, if you have a partner, we can have that partner try to pull the towel through. So if he brace, brace, sets his full trunk stability, and then from there I have him maintain it as I try to pull this bout out, or this towel out from under him. It's amazing the kind of challenge that produces to continuously producing pressure back here. Now let's go ahead and take this belt off and talk about another belt. When it comes to breath belts are a kind of sore subject within certain groups in the strength world, but the fact of the matter is it's simply a tool. It's a tool that actually does provide quite a bit of benefit. It's simply a belt that facilitates or increases or encourages, I would say, the expansion horizontally throughout the entirety of the breath. But there's a little confusion as to when you should use the breath belt. Is the breath belt going to be a belt that can replace the rigid belt? No. The breath belt does not provide the same opportunity to maximize IAP. It's simply a tool to facilitate better horizontal expansion in the movement itself. So when it comes to in-movement fixes, the breath belt can actually be really, really good tool to doing exactly that. So if I have Connor right now throw on this breath belt, he can go ahead and have something now in the movement that has a little bit more flex to it to actually breathe into. Beautiful. So because this is meant to expand, now he has something that's much easier to facilitate that horizontal expansion in all directions. Very nice. Now, pretend that he's still having an issue with a particular portion of his trunk, that full guy wire system creating stability. I can actually add this guy in as well. So the breath belt is specifically designed to be able to add things into it. If you only have a lacrosse ball, that works too. But the reason I love this drill so much is specifically because if you do not make the fix it's trying to facilitate, it gets very painful very quickly. It actually forces you to brace harder in that specific spot, because this will be very painful until you create the utmost rigidity within that spot. So not only are you provided a really robust tactile cue, but furthermore, there's significant pain if you're loosey-goosey there in a sense. But when you create rigidity, all of a sudden that pain goes away. So this is a really good correction method. So what I can do is, pretending it's a lateral portion that's a limitation, let's loosen this just a little bit. He's going to loosen this bad boy. There's actually specific pockets you can stick this into, but you can also just shove it in kind of like that there. So he can tie it over the top, put it on like normal, and now he has this digging into the portion that is lacking, and Connor can attest the fact that this is very uncomfortable. Very, very uncomfortable. But he can go ahead and set up like this, get under bar, unrack it, squat it, and constantly have that stimulus that does absolute wonders. So to recap here, those are some of our favorite in-movement fixes. We gave you some cues, some tactile feedback, some very specific drills. Now let's go ahead and get into some regression-based fixes when needed. So the first regression-based drill I want to cover is a very simple one, the sandwich drill. This is actually one of my absolute favorite go-tos. It requires zero equipment, and the best part of it is, I always say, that if you are having, let's say, breathing issues, you have these deeply ingrained compensatory mechanisms when you go to breathe. This could be an entire course in itself as far as a totality of bad effects that comes with breathing vertically throughout the day. Humans were meant to breathe horizontally. Horizontal inflation really maximizes performance stability and prevents injury when it comes to the confines of lifting, but there are far more benefits outside of lifting as well. But with this being said, if you have a lifter that's struggling with it, it's actually a really good idea to practice better breathing, not just in training, but throughout the entirety of the day. And the reason I love this sandwich drill is because you can use it prior to getting under the barbell to potentiate that horizontal expansion or better rigidity within certain portions of the trunk. But furthermore, you can do so while you're at a stoplight in your car. You can do so while you're watching TV at home. In fact, when I have really struggled with my breathing mechanics, I have done the sandwich drill along with like seated oblique firing and things like that, probably a dozen times a day. It's such a low barrier to entry drill that can do wonders. If you constantly remind your body what it's like to breathe optimally, it can make some really, really big improvements quickly. And then all of a sudden you get to a point where that's your new default and you no longer have issues while training. But one other note to add there is I still have to go through phases of training, phases of my life where I have to revert back to drills like this, because keep in mind, breathing improvements, bracing improvements is not like riding a bike, right? You don't learn how to breathe really well and then you're set for life. That's not the case in any way, shape, or form, because keep in mind, these compensatory strategies to breathe is something that is a stress response that you'll have throughout the entirety of life. So for me personally, even earlier this year, had some little bit of health issues, had a little family issues, work was getting stressful. Then all of a sudden I started catching myself, and you'll notice even when you get stressful news, you could be breathing perfectly. The second you get that stressful news, you'll notice that big vertical stress response. So you will have to go back to working on this stuff in the future throughout the entirety of your life, because again, it is a very consistent response you'll have to stress and other factors of this nature. But with this being said, Connor, turn sideways a little bit for me here. When it comes to sandwich drill, we're going to take your thumbs and poke it into more so the posterior aspect of the trunk, take the fingers and dig it into the anterior. This should not be comfortable. In fact, this should be kind of shitty to do. With that being said though, what Connor's going to do is he's going to go ahead and relax completely, close his eyes, and slowly breathe into simultaneously both his thumbs and his fingers, very, very slow. 4 to 5 second inhale, 1 to 2 second hold, 4 to 5 second exhale, 1 to 2 second hold, and repeat. And typically what I like the lifters to do is a set of this will be 5 repetitions of this, and then separately, without breathing, he's just going to focus on firing, using those trunk stabilizers, just create that co-contraction, just bracing. He's going to do that another 5 times. Each time he does so, he's going to hold it for a few seconds. And then lastly, he's going to go through 3 repetitions of the totality of what he needs to create, like he's about to go through the eccentric of a 1 rep squat. So if he was about to go through the eccentric, he's going to brace, breathe into that brace, and brace once more, the entire time feeling that tactile stimulus to make sure he's creating that outer sheath that we're looking for. The sandwich drill, it's fantastic. I love using it prior to training as a potentiation drill, but furthermore, I love doing it in between working sets, in between warm-up sets, and it's even a drill that can have an amazing effect doing throughout the entirety of the day. I would argue this is actually the most important facet of maybe the entire presentation, is the testing part of trunk stability. You never truly understand the severity or what kind of issue you have within trunk stabilization until you actually test it. But there's some really important caveats to testing it. What I typically have lifters do is I have them sit down, be nice and upright, and then from there I'm going to palpate and assess their ability to inflate, to brace, and have them just go through their normal default mechanics to do so. Now for today, we're gonna do it standing. Standing or sitting, not really the biggest difference in the world. Ideally it'd be sitting, but you'll still get the point of what I'm gonna show. So pretend Connor, I'm gonna go ahead and put him through some testing. What I'll have him do is I'll stand nice and upright. I'm gonna have him actually turn a little bit to like a 45-degree angle so you guys can see the most important portions of this. Then what I'll have him do is I'll have him breathe normally, right? We're not even going to brace. I just want him to breathe within his 100% normal strategy to do so, or mechanics to do so. And as he's doing so, I'm going to watch very carefully. Again, typically he'd be seated, but I'm looking at expansion back here. I'm looking at lateral expansion. I'm looking at what's happening in the front. The first portion of this is simply assessing with 0 feedback, 0 cues, 0 anything. Then once he does this several times, I'm going to actually start to feel things. The biggest caveat to this is that when I go to palpate, I am not trying to create a stimulus to change it. This is an assessment. So a common mistake people make in this is they'll try to feel that posterior portion, see how they're inflating back there, then they'll do this. They'll dig in deep. When you dig in deep, what happens? Provide a tactile cue, they change their strategies, you don't see or don't have a proper assessment. So when he's doing this, I'll actually use my fingertips, these fingertips here, because they have the best ability to assess, or the best proprioceptive ability to assess. So I use my fingers throughout the entirety of the posterior portion here, like this on one side, like this on the other side. Barely touch, ideally under the shirt or without a shirt, but over the shirt will work. And then from here, I have him continue to breathe, and I can just barely feel what's going on back here. If he has a bilateral imbalance, I will feel it. If he's not inflating fully back here, I'll feel it. If he has no activity back here, again, I will feel it. And what I'll typically do is I'll start with the most medial portion right next to the spine, have him do a few reps, go a little further out. A few reps, a little further out. Few reps, a little further out. I'll go all the way throughout the trunk, taking notes as I do so. And just like that, I have provided a proper assessment to his ability to inflate and create intra-abdominal pressure, his breathing strategies. As I'm taking notes specifically of the shortcomings within his strategies. Then I can do the same thing with his brace. So with his brace, I can just have him brace and just feel what's going on back here. So I'll typically do the breath with those touch points, the brace with the same touch points, then lastly have him go through his brace, breath, brace, like he's about to go through the eccentric of a squat with those same touch points. But throughout the entirety of it, I am not providing him a stimulus to change, barely fingertips, and once I have done my full assessment, I see all of his shortcomings, then all of a sudden I can create strategies to specifically address what's going on with him, because unfortunately you will never be able to see that with the naked eye. The actual assessment like this is absolutely needed to get the best idea possible, as long as we do not change his mechanics by poking in too deeply. Keep in mind, big difference between assessment and providing tactile cue to spark change. And the next category of fault is going to be hinging issues. This is very common and very misunderstood. Understand that when a lifter goes to hinge in a squat and a deadlift, what we should see is perfect spine neutrality as they do so, but furthermore, a backwards articulation of their hips as they go to hinge, while again, maintaining that lumbopelvic stability and position. So we're gonna show two faults in particular without the barbell, just turn sideways. So the first one we're gonna show, I call this bending over instead of hinging over. Connor, show bending over exactly. Stand up straight, do it one more time for me. What you'll notice is hips aren't articulating back, instead his upper body is simply folding forward. When a lifter does that during the squat, they always shift to their toes. There's a slew of faults that can come from this. Typically lots of back pain and issues like that tend to come too, but most common of which, indicator-wise, is weight shifts to toes, oftentimes so severe that heels literally lift up off the floor. So bending over versus hinging over, one of the most common ones. Just for fun, Connor, show the proper one, show what we're looking for here, hips articulating back. Just like that, very big difference between the two. When he hinges, it's just far better mechanics, far more advantageous position to handle load, but furthermore, the load stays centrated in the middle of his body. So that's the first. The second most common hinging fault, and I would actually argue this is likely the most common, is anterior pelvic tilt. Now here's the important note here. When it comes to anterior pelvic tilt, most of the time, when somebody has it, it stems from breathing and bracing limitations. Because they don't stabilize their trunk fully, that's why we have a loss in position as they go to squat. But sometimes I'll see lifters with perfect mechanics, perfect stability, and they still go through anterior pelvic tilt. Let's go ahead and show it, Connor. Beautiful. So typically it happens right at the start of the eccentric. Typically, there's a few different places it can happen, but you'll always see this where oftentimes upper body just refuses to fall forward, but then hips kick back and we see that lumbar extension, anterior pelvic tilt, very, very common. Now there's a few different root causes of why this happens. In my personal opinion, the most common stems from really shitty high school weights coaches. Honestly, that really is the most common thing it stems from. The chest up, head up, look up cues. They say there's no bad cues. It's a good sentiment, but at the same time, there certainly is. And I would argue those very much are not the greatest cues, especially for, say, a low bar back squat. But when a lifter focuses on chest up or staying upright, well, guess what? There has to be a hinge. And if we try to hinge while keeping our upper body straight up, we force ourselves into anterior pelvic tilt. Now, anterior pelvic tilt, slew of issues that comes with it. To name a few, we change the length-tension relationships of our primary movers. For example, hamstrings lengthened, quads shortened, all the anterior musculature within the hip aggressively shortened. So commonly what people have when they do this is a severe lumbar pump. They'll also have a lot of TFL and just anterior hip pain. They also tend to have a lot of chronic soreness within the hamstrings, things like that. They often pull their hamstrings very consistently. They also tend to have a lot of downstream motor control issues. Oftentimes when people start with anterior pelvic tilt, coming out of the hole, they have massive knee cave. And then people tend to assess on putting a band around the knees and trying to address the knees when the stem root cause of the issue was actually this up here, actually this up here. So with this being said, and that's length-tension relationships, just a part of it. We are also passively lengthening our abdominals. We're also putting ourselves into lumbar extensions. There's a slew of reasons why it's a very detrimental fault. And again, one of the most common root causes is that obsession with staying upright, that obsession with going chest up, but also sometimes people just don't know how to articulate their hips back very effectively. So with all of this being said, we have to understand that everybody needs to hinge during the squat to varying degrees. How much you need to hinge depends on barbell positioning, depends on hip morphology, depends on femur length, torso length, and many factors of this nature, but everybody has to some degree. With that being said, if you don't allow your upper body to hinge, you will force yourself into anterior pelvic tilt. Keep in mind, proper hinge mechanics needs that upper body to fall forward to maintain spine neutrality. One of my favorite references or cues to use for this, which we'll get into a little bit more here in in just a second is actually going to be exactly the shirt pulling down cue is amazing, but also pretend there's a rod going from the top of our head and coming out our ass. If there's a rod right there, then our body would have to move in a synergistic fashion. If we had that rod, this couldn't happen like it shouldn't happen. So with all that being said, those are the two most common hinge faults, both of which we do not want to see. Let's talk about some in-movement fixes to get rid of it, as well as some regression-based fixes that are very profound in getting rid of it in a very efficient manner. Let's go ahead and talk about in-movement fixes. There's a few drills we can do for this. Most of the drill-based fixes have to be regressions usually, but there is one drill in particular I absolutely love for this. Most of the in-movement fixes, though, are based upon cues, some really fantastic cues. So for starters, let's go over a few different cues we really like. A few of which I already mentioned. One of my favorites, in fact, I would say my favorite that I kind of made up one day, had really cool effects for myself and all my clients, and I've used very consistently ever since. When you hinge, again, most of it stems from an inability to allow your upper body to fall forward. So when you tell a lifter, first off, we need it to fall forward, that alone can have a really profound effect. But furthermore, when they are hinging, I usually tell them to act like someone's pulling their shirt forward. Pull your shirt forward at a perfectly synchronized rate with your hips articulating back. So it should look like this here. That's one of my favorite cues to actually do this. So that is a great cue for when upper body falling forward is a limitation. When hips articulating back is a limitation, a really good cue is act like you're trying to reach your hamstrings and or glutes to the wall behind you. So if I'm squatting this way and I focus on my hamstring glutes reaching to the wall behind me, bending over turns into hinging over, trying to push those structures to the wall behind me. Really good cue for that. And then the last big cue or strategy I like to use in the movement itself is simply going slower. When somebody has deeply ingrained patterns to go into anterior pelvic tilt or bend over, the best benefit you can have is simply to go slower. Their body becomes more aware of where their center of mass is and how they can hinge more proficiently. Connor, any more cues you like to use personally?
Yeah, easily. One of my favorite cues that I like to use is shut the fridge door with your butt. So imagine that you got breakfast in your hands, you're gonna shut the refrigerator door with your butt, you're good to go.
And that's another really good one. Keep in mind, cues are individual to a person, so sometimes one will connect really well with them, sometimes others don't. That's a really good one for many people. Other people might resonate a little bit more with hamstrings or glutes, just depends upon the person, which is why cueing is often a little bit of trial and error. Now, with that being said, my favorite in-movement fix as far as a drill goes is the banded hinge. So, especially when the individual lacks the ability to actually articulate their hips back, if Connor turns this way for me and pretend he has a barbell on his back, you can actually set this up to where Connor ties this off to a rack behind him. So pretend I am a human rack and we have a good amount of tension on this band. All of a sudden, it becomes way easier to articulate his hips back as he actually hinges. So what he can do is just practice the first third range of motion of the squat, since that's usually where the problems come from. So he'll hinge, you'll have a little bit of knee flexion maybe, and then come right back up, just practicing that initial portion. Beautiful. Again, you can do that with a partner or just tie this off to a wall. Now let's talk about a few regression-based fixes, because my goodness, can these be fantastic. Let's start out with my favorite drill imaginable. Now, the one caveat to this is you do kind of need a particular piece of equipment, and that is this shoulder rock here. Some people see us do this and go, I could use a PVC pipe, but I promise you it is not the same. It will not actually provide the same benefit. So with that being said though, what Connor is going to do is he's going to start by getting into the starting position. So he's going to put this along his back. If you hinge ideally and maintain neutrality as you do so, you'll have 3 points of contact with this shoulder rock. First of which is the back of the head, second of which is the middle of the scapula, and third of which is the top of the glutes. If he goes into anterior pelvic tilt, show him, he loses middle contact. If he goes into posterior pelvic tilt, he loses, almost got me there, the glute contact. With that being said, if he maintains all 3 points as he hinges and starts to squat, we can guarantee neutrality. So what he's going to do is, this is a great prep drill, really good prep drill. A lot of the drills that we're showing with each one of these faults, when integrated into the warm-up, can potentiate performance in a way to where in the movement these issues go away. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this in the warm-up, in between warm-up sets, in between working sets sometimes even, where he hinges, starts to squat a little bit, and we just do like a third range of motion squat. Beautiful. We definitely don't need full range of motion. He'll go through this typically with a nice slow tempo, anywhere from 8 to 10 times, and this forces them to hinge hinge perfectly. Drills that force you to do something perfectly are always ones that we tend to bias towards. This is by far my favorite drill to improve upon hinging limitations. Now, the second of which is going to be a banded R&T RDL. Typically, we like to do this with a kettlebell, but for today's sake, pretend this 25-pound bumper is a kettlebell. So he's going to face the same direction. This is very similar to the previous drill I showed. Beautiful there. And again, he's going to tie this off to a rack behind him, hold the kettlebell here. Typically, he'd be holding it more so like a kettlebell swing kind of position, but he can hold it in a goblet position too. Either way is perfectly fine. This has a good amount of tension on it, and he simply practices the hinge. This is a drill that's a little bit better for, again, the issue of not being able to articulate hips back. This drill I bias towards as a fixed two, hips not articulating back, while the other drill is shoulder rock drill I bias towards when anterior pelvic tilt is the issue we're trying to address. The next category of faults we're going to get into is rooting and foot ankle complex faults. These are extremely prevalent, and as I mentioned in the lecture portion, it's second on the hierarchy of things that we need to be focused on, and second as far as things that we need to address. We have a slew of faults going on in a movement. The most common examples are pronation of the foot, supination of foot, and shifting to our toes, shifting to our heels. So when I say pronation, supination is simply when we lose that middle contact, exactly, just like that. And when I say pronation, that's what I mean. What I mean by that is collapsing inwards. And oftentimes this is followed up by severe knee cave. And we may talk a little bit more about knee cave. This isn't a fault that we'll get too far into in this specific presentation, specifically because if we fix this and we fix that, knee cave tends to never really happen. I'll talk a little bit as to why that is here in just a second. So with all that being said, the last note I want to give is foot structure does dictate, at least somewhat, what rooting fault you're most likely to go through. So when a lifter lacks the ability to root to the floor effectively, their structure dictates or tends to influence which way their foot is going to bias towards fault-wise. So for example, Connor has some flippers. He has a very flat foot, as do I. So people with flatter feet and smaller arches or non-existent arches always tend to bias towards, when rooting issues occur, collapsing inward or pronation, which is why if you have flat feet, you often always deal with knee cave when rooting issues exist. But if you have a really high arch, then it's the exact opposite. High arches, when rooting issues occur, they tend to bias towards supination. They always have supination issues. And if you think about it from a logical standpoint, this makes perfect sense. And with all the people I worked with, this tends to be very consistently the case. Like when I used to talk about this, I used to say, you know, for the most part this is the case. Now I've kind of gotten to the point where like almost 100% of the time when someone has a rooting issue, structure dictates what exactly that is. But let's go ahead and show what we're talking about in the actual movement. So Connor, do me a terrible favor and unrack the bar and walk it out wrong. He's going to walk it out forward just to show foot very clearly. Beautiful. So once he sets his stance, we'll show pronation, supination first. So Connor, first show the fault you're most likely to run into, pronation, collapsing in. Beautifully terrible. So stop right here for a second, Connor. Understand that we have three main points of contact within the foot, or our tripod foot. We need to not only maintain a floor contact with, but evenly distribute the load across. Those points are base of the heel, base of the big toe, and base of the pinky toe. When somebody goes through pronation, they lose either weight distribution or contact, if it gets severe enough, with the base of the pinky toe. So show me one more example, Connor, and what you'll notice if you look carefully, the base of the pinky toe comes up, which we really do not want to see, and then upstream a slew of faults tend to happen, such as knee cave. Now on the opposite end of the spectrum, especially for people that have higher arches, supination. Let's go ahead and show that next. Beautiful. And what you'll notice is what's leaving the floor, what's losing contact. It is the base of the big toe. That part of the tripod is being sacrificed when this happens. Now, the last two examples I want to give here is shifting to toes, shifting to heels. Shifting to toes is definitely far more prevalent, especially if you're an individual that suffers from collapsing inwards or pronation. Show shifting to the toes. Beautifully terrible. Now again, sometimes this happens just to a very small degree that's impossible to see with the naked eye, where just the load is primarily distributed through the front of the foot, while other times the heels literally come off the floor, which is getting so severe, I get really concerned as a coach, and it's definitely going to diminish your ability to actually produce force upstream. Keep in mind, with each one of these faults, when we lose even weight distribution, or worse yet, we lose contact with those 3 points, what's always going to happen is we're going to lose upstream stability, and our body's going to down-regulate its ability to produce force. As I mentioned in the lecture section, your brain has this amazing anti-injury mechanism where when it senses an instability, it refuses to produce as much force or be able to maintain its relationships. As I mentioned in the lecture section, our brain has this amazing ability to As I mentioned in the lecture section, our brain has this amazing anti-injury mechanism where it senses an instability or a loss in contact / connection with the floor, it refuses to produce as much force, which is why this is very, very important. So when these happen, upstream loss in stability, upstream loss in force production, which is why it is a major thing we need to look towards fixing. Connor, you can go ahead and re-rack that bad boy there. Let's talk about in-movement fixes. So I would say the biggest driver of issues like this is actually because in somebody's cadence of cues they go through prior to squatting, they don't include anything for rooting. This is actually very, very common. So as I covered in the lecture section, I really like the cadence of splay and then short foot. And when we do the short foot cue, it is very important that we don't actually crunch our toes and decrease surface area contact. Instead, we are just suction cupping to the floor. But as far as in-movement fixes goes, that is by far the most robust benefit you can get, is simply adding to your cadence that part of it. So for example, a squat cadence for me is, first off, get tall. Second off, breathe into my already established brace. Brace once more, pack the head, engage my lats, splay my feet, suction cup the floor, and then hinge and squat. That's kind of a cadence that I go through each and every time to create consistency, while most people do not include the rooting part. So that is by far the most profound benefit. Now, the next in-movement fix cue that we can suggest is stacking the ankles. And there's a specific drill we can utilize to potentiate this better, but especially if you have the consistent issue of collapsing inwards, oftentimes it's less of a rooting issue and more of an ankle complex issue. So for example, what a lot of people do, Connor, if you can show this, what a lot of people do is as they start the eccentric of their squat, watch my knees. They kind of go straight forward. They don't stack over the top of the foot and ankle. Instead, they go straight forward, and immediately we have a loss in position right when we start the eccentric. But if Connor stands up tall and instead focuses on stacking the ankles as he goes to the eccentric, then all of a sudden the ankle is directly over the top of the foot, and we have far better distribution of load, weight, and position over the top of the foot. So that's a really, really good cue. But as far as in-movement fix drills, absolute favorite of mine is going to be the floss band. The floss band is very profound. So we use the floss band in the exact method required to fix the issue at hand. If Connor is biasing towards pronation, what point of contact is he losing? He's losing the base of the pinky toe. If he's biasing towards supination, what point of contact is he losing? The base of the big toe. And that's exactly where we're going to put this floss band. It's an excellent correction method that oftentimes fixes the problem in the movement itself like that. It's amazing. So let's pretend the reality of Connor's situation is what we're going to address first, which is pronation. So if he biases towards pronation, specifically because of his structure kind of exacerbating that likelihood, what I want you to do, Connor, is get into your normal squat stance for me. And what we're actually going to do, since he's biasing towards pronation, he's losing the base of the pinky toe. So I'm actually going to put the corner of this floss band right under his pinky toe. And then I'm going to go ahead and give this a little bit of pressure, or a little bit of tension. From here, he's going to squat, and he has to maintain contact. He has to distribute his weight over the base of that pinky toe. Now, usually when you have someone do this, they bias towards their normal squat mechanics, and it snaps. Right? There we go. So exactly. So if he goes through his normal mechanics and loses that contact, it immediately snaps. Then he tries it again, and he tends to correct it relatively quickly where he doesn't lose that contact anymore. This is by far my favorite drill to actually address this. We can do this in our warm-ups with a goblet squat. We can do this in our warm-ups with the actual barbell. We can even do this in our working sets. Now next, if he's biasing towards the supination, I'm going to have him get into a squat stance, and we're going to do the same thing, but bias the loss of contact, or bias the band where he's losing contact was the base of the big toe. So I'm doing the same thing. And he has to correct to maintain contact. If he evenly distributes weight, it should look like this. Band will not snap. If, however, he goes into supination midway through a squat, it will snap. With that being said, these are our favorite drills to fix the problem really quickly. Then the last two examples would be If he's shifting to his toes, where are we going to put it? The heel. If he's shifting to his heels, where are we going to put it? The toe. So there's many different ways we can work out utilizing this drill, specifically addressing the shortcoming that he's actually having. Now, the last in-movement drill I want to talk about is going to specifically address the collapsing inward. I would say that's by far the most common example. Most common example of rooting issues people have is pronation, knee cave, collapsing inward. So if that's the case, what I'm going to do is, it's a little hard to set up in the movement itself, but Connor's going to throw this around his ankles. He doubles up the band, X's it, and just throws around his ankles only, right? So when he does this, he's going to put it at the absolute base of his ankle. The lower, the better, beautiful. And then from here, he now has a stimulus to stack his ankle against. So from here, Connor, don't even squat, just stack it a few times. Exactly. So he can actually practice stacking it against that band to start his squat. And then once he gets comfortable with that cue or that motion, now he can actually integrate it into a full-on squat pattern. Beautiful. Constantly having that stimulus to drive out against to center his weight, center the load over the top of the foot. We can do this with a barbell on the back, a fantastic in-movement fix. Now, let's go ahead and move on to talking about regression-based fixes. A few of these drills are amazing. We absolutely love them, starting off with the band X rooting drill. All right, so there's 2 to 3 drills we love to use as regressions, oftentimes incorporating them into our warm-up to potentiate the awareness of our rooting and the practice of our rooting. My absolute favorite is going to be the band X rooting drill, but there's one important caveat. It is very hard to set up. I mean, not really. Actually, it's actually very easy, but it's kind of confusing. So watch this very carefully. We're going to do it 2 times prior to actually putting it on. So Connor, show them for me. Beautiful. And that's all it is, to start at least. That's all it is. Do it one more time. I know this seems borderline condescending to show it twice, but we get to put on seminars all around the world, and every single time we do this, the second we break out into active drills, people immediately forget. So we want to show it twice. Beautiful. Now, once he has it in X, he's going to put it around his ankles, very similar to the banded ankle stack drill, with one big change, or actually a few big changes. So once he has it here, he gets into his normal squat stance. There is a chance, depending upon your squat stance width, that we have to use a heavier band. We have to triple up the band and do things of that nature. Now I'm going to put it on Connor for him just to show it very clearly. What we're going to do is we're going to take the 2 bands here and put it around his big toe. Now what that's doing is it's actively lifting up his big toe. And I do the same thing, except only with 1 band around the pinky toe. Now, you can do 2, but for most people, 2 is far too severe, far, far too severe. Don't try to win the drill, just provide yourself the stimulus to make the changes you want. Now from here, you'll notice big toes being pulled up, pinky toes being pulled up. So what does he have to do to respond to that? Actively root and drive into the floor. This is a wonderful correction method. So now he's getting the stimulus of forcing him to drive the base of the big toe down, base of the pinky toe down, and he's getting the banded ankle stack stimulus. So if he does this right, sets it up right, all of the major rooting issues goes away like that. And we love using this as a warm-up, typically with a goblet load. We can do it without load too. All right, Connor, go ahead and try a few reps for me. Beautiful. Again, he's having to actively drive those bases of contact into the floor. He is not afforded the ability to really lift them up or experience any faults. Now, you can do this technically with a barbell on your back. It just gets a little dicey during the walkout. You typically have to have someone put them on for you. You know, typically having training partners touch your sweaty feet, not the best thing in the world. So I typically bias towards this being a warm-up exercise with a goblet load, though you can do it with a barbell on your back. The next one I want to cover is going to be KB passes. Now, we're going to go ahead and use a simple 10-pound plate, but pretend it is a kettlebell. Same exact stimulus. The kettlebell is just a little bit easier to do it with. But what Connor's going to do is he is going to first grab this load. I want him to turn sideways to the camera. Now, to set this up, it's very similar to a hip airplane if you've ever seen it. He's going to slowly hinge and center his weight over the downed foot. You'll notice his toe is still touching the floor. For the vast majority of people, having that toe like a half inch off the floor is ideal. That way it can quickly go to the floor if balance is lost. Now from here, he's going to go ahead and transfer that load right side, left side, right side, left side. And what this does is it kind of wakes up, I guess you could say, or potentiates the performance of those smaller intrinsic muscles within the foot. The foot is having to react and actually grasp the floor very, very hard when he does this. So you can do this in a few different ways. It's similar to the dead bug. We could use it with a smaller or lighter intensity prior to squatting to really, really help those musculature actually get better at rooting prior to squatting, or you can do it at the end of a training session with a higher intensity, more load to get a more robust training stimulus for that intrinsic musculature within the foot. He's going to keep on going back and forth. Typically we do, let's say, anywhere from 6 to 10 passes per side while maintaining this position. And the last regression-based drill is actually the same thing we showed in movement. The floss band to specific parts of the foot is actually fantastic as a warm-up exercise too. Often you can actually do that yourself. So let's actually go ahead and show that real quick. So Connor, grab that 10-pound plate for me. And what Connor can do is he can actually take this guy here, and let's say he's biasing towards that supination. He's going to put it base of big toe, and then he can do actually same thing on the other side if he wanted to. Beautiful, same thing on the other side. Excellent. So he can actually receive that stimulus on both sides, get it around his arms, almost in a Zercher position. And then as he's holding the load, he's going to squat while lifting the load up just a little bit. And now he's receiving a very similar stimulus to what we showed in movement, but this can be more of a warm-up based version of that exact drill. If he's biasing towards supination, big toe, biasing towards pronation, pinky toe, and we can actually do both sides at the same time without a partner. That about covers it for rooting faults. The last thing I want to cover here is going to be case study like examples of when a lifter has multiple different faults, what do we address first? Well, let's go and get into it. So Connor's going to go ahead and get under the barbell. He's going to walk out the wrong way, for example's sake. Just bear with us here. And then from there, he's going to show a very common squat example. Beautiful. And re-rack it. All right. My big question for everybody is, what do we address first? What was very apparent to me is that he definitely had some supination foot, he had some knee cave, he had vertical breathing, he had a concentric brace when he went to actually brace. So what do we address first, looking at our hierarchy? Breathing, bracing, trunk stability. So if I saw something like that, I would try to correct it in the movement itself, likely with some tactile cueing strategies as well as some mental cueing strategies. So for an example like that, the very first thing I would actually do is I'd have him stop when he walks out, give him some tactile stimulus, and then from there ask him to close his eyes, breathe into my fingers and thumbs nice and slow. I'd tell him to draw his rib cage down like he's pressing down on a ball in air, and then from there go through his squat. And the vast majority of time, as long as he executes, the rooting issues go away and the knee cave issues go away, and then obviously the bracing issues went away. And if we have to go through regressions, what I'd likely bias towards is just simply a sandwich drill, simply doing the sandwich drill. Having him sit down on a bench, thumbs and fingers, practice breathing, bracing, firing his trunk stabilizers against his fingers and thumbs, and then getting back under the barbell, going through those same cueing strategies in the movement, and almost always the issues dissipate or go away entirely, including the rooting and knee issues. Because keep in mind, though I didn't go through a lot of explanation on this in the lecture or presentation itself, knee cave issues are always a root cause of either foot-ankle complex or something happening at the trunk/hip, usually hip. So with that being said, what controls and stabilizes hip position? Trunk stability. So I usually kind of talk about it as more of a trunk stability or foot-ankle complex issue. The way I like to think about it is the knees are like a private in a stereotypical military movie. The private does not think for himself, does not do for himself. He only does what his commanders tell him to do. The commanders in this scenario are the foot ankle and the trunk hip complex. So whenever there's a knee cave issue, don't look towards throwing a band around the knees and doing a bunch of useless external rotation stuff. Instead, look towards what's happening, either foot ankle or trunk stability hip. And then from there, we can address the root cause, and knee cave always tends to go away. Now Connor's going to show another very common example with one small alteration. Let me see if you can notice it. Beautiful. Rack it for me. All right. So what you'll notice is that was an exact replica of the previous example with one small delineation. If you couldn't tell already, it was unrack mechanics were not so favorable. During the unrack, he entered kind of that kyphosis kind of posture. His elbows kicked out, his head position came forward. There's a little bit of thoracic spine flexion. So in an example like that, normally we'd go through that hierarchy, start with breathing, bracing, spine mechanics, but that was an example where we break the rules. Every rule set that we give out, every principle we talk about, there's oftentimes caveats and exceptions to that, and that's a very good and common example. The second he got into this position on the unrack, dead upon arrival. He is never going to be able to reestablish a good position with heavier load or be able to breathe and brace effectively. So after this position is established and then he breathes this big vertical breathing pattern, he was forced to do that with the positional limitation. So while normally we'd go through breathing and bracing for something like this, we'd first go through why did he enter that position in the first place. In the positional fault section, we talked about the root cause being not going through the stability sequence prior to unrack, poor unrack mechanics, and poor walkout mechanics. With that example specifically, it was very clearly unrack mechanics were very poor. So we look towards fixing that so the positional fault never took place and he has the opportunity to breathe and brace more effectively. So the first place I would go is looking at the unrack mechanics. I would likely have him get under the barbell, make sure he's fully stabilized everywhere, and then actually cue him to, pretend you're about to unrack it for me, I'd actually cue him to think squeeze the glutes and double chin maneuver. Pack the head as you unrack. Beautiful. Hold that position. Slowly walk out, and that's usually the only change we need to make. And by the way, double chin maneuver, one of my favorite cues. Again, a lot of people have positional faults that often stem from them not knowing what the hell to do with their head. If you think about the double chin maneuver, try to create as many chins as possible. It creates a fantastic position, and it's a cue that everybody can relate to. I tell the lifter, get as ugly as possible, create as many chins as possible. Lifting is not a place to look pretty. Lifting is a place to lift heavy shit and do so safely. So create a double chin as you unrack, and they end up getting in a nice tall posture, not to mention actually helps the efficiency of the unrack itself. People unrack while wasting less energy and do so typically far more quickly. All right, Connor, let's go ahead and get into the last example. This is another very common one. Let's see if you can point it out. Beautiful. Go ahead and rack it, Connor. Very nice. Terrible. Love to see it. So if you look at that very carefully, there's very clearly two major issues. Anterior pelvic tilt for one, and another one is going to be severe knee cave and a little bit of pronation of the foot itself. So why did this happen? Oftentimes, when someone goes through anterior pelvic tilt, we got to look to what controls pelvic position, which is trunk stability. But when it comes to Connor in that example he just gave, his trunk stability looked really good. And if I were to palpate, I'm sure I'd feel a really nice outer sheath. It was more of a hinging issue because he did not have very good hinge mechanics, because he did not allow his upper body to fall forward. He was forced into anterior pelvic tilt. Once anterior pelvic tilt happens, he loses control of downstream structures. Knee cave is more likely to happen. Rooting issues are more likely to happen. So it's a downward cascade of detrimental effects from there, all starting with anterior pelvic tilt that was caused by poor hinging, specifically caused by obsessing with keeping the chest up or staying vertical with the upper body. So with an example like that, I'm going to tell Connor, I'm going to give him some cues in the movement to get him to hinge more effectively. With an example like that, the biggest of which I love is going to be pulling the shirt forward. So I'd have him do the repetition again. I'd tell him, hey, we're going to go 5-second eccentric, very slow, especially as you start the eccentric. And what I want you to focus on is act like someone's pulling your shirt forward, and I tell him it's okay to have your upper body fold. That's an integral part of hinge mechanics. So I would tell him that, cue him like that, and see the result. And if the result is still not all that favorable, I would regress towards the shoulder rock drill. I'd have him do some shoulder rock hinges, 1 to 2 sets, 6 to 10 reps, nice and slow, get back under the bar, go through the same cueing, and the issue always tends to go away. So those are a few case study-like examples I love to use to actually show how to apply these principles when you see a slew of faults. What do you address first to get the most most global effect on movement quality and to propel that lifter into a place where they can lift heavier loads more safely, which again is one of the most important foundations of being a coach. To recap here, as strength coaches, trainers, or clinicians, it's our job to create as much resiliency for the athlete as possible. But here's the unfortunate truth we have to come to terms with. We can just as easily, in fact, I'd go as far as to say more easily, create further fragility as we can resiliency. With that being said, the number one factor that decides which route we're going to have the athlete or individual go through is our ability to optimally make movement pattern improvements or interventions. Within this guided solution, I provided you kind of a framework, a hierarchy in how you should address movement pattern interventions to start with the changes that are going to have the most global effect. We also touched on a series of different drills that do a fantastic job on making those improvements in the movement itself, because the fact of the matter is, oftentimes, doesn't matter what population you're working with, you have a very truncated period of time to work with the person. And unfortunately, sometimes the person themselves don't always come in the best conditions to learn, whether it's that they are hungover from the night before, don't have the best attention span, or don't want to be there in the first place, which unfortunately is oftentimes the case that pushes even more towards the importance of doing movement pattern intervention as efficiently as possible. And if you can fix the problem in the movement itself, you always should. Our saying should not be, when in doubt, regress it out. Instead, we should always fix that problem in the movement if we can, and we often can. So we went through a series of drills and how we can do so optimally. Then when regressions are needed, we provided some really creative and efficient drills in fixing it as well. The last thing I want to touch on is throughout the entirety of the drills that I covered, keep in mind those drills are fantastic for the warm-up. When it comes to warm-up principles, I'm a big believer in the fact that the warm-up, there is no ideal warm-up for every single lifter. That's kind of like asking the question of what the best nutrition strategy is for humans. There is none. It's an inherently flawed question. So when it comes to the warm-up, it should be adapted to what the lifter is struggling with in the movement itself and his body's preparedness on the day. So for me personally, when I have a lifter in front of me that's having trunk stability issues, rooting issues, I'm not only going to put him through a warm-up that just gets blood flow in the muscle. I'm not just going to put him through a warm-up that makes sense generally for the first movement he's doing, but instead I'm going to structure that warm-up in a way to where I potentiate performance within the exact movement limitations he's having. So what I'm going to utilize is the band X rooting drill. I'm going to do some dead bug progressions. I'm going to do a little bit of banded sphinx to get specifically that posterior portion activated and firing better. I'm going to structure his warm-up specifically to help with him lifting as efficiently as possible. And oftentimes when we see movement inefficiencies that need to be improved, we can address that in the future with a very concise warm-up plan that we provide them. And lastly, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to leave a comment under this video or reach out to us in our social channels. Also, if you have any further requests on future content creation, let me know. My name is Brandon Morgan. I'm Director of Education at Kabuki, and we want to model our future content creation based upon what you want specifically. So feel free, if you have any content suggestions whatsoever or things you want to see particularly, let us know and we'd love to create it.